From the moment I was old enough to read romance novels, I believed that my wedding day would be one of the happiest days of my life. I had pictured the train of my gown sweeping across the grass, a soft breeze catching my veil, and my beloved waiting at the altar with tears shining in his eyes. No matter how much life tested my patience, that image remained. By the time I met Ryan, I was ready to believe I had found the person meant to fulfill my dream. He had this easy grin, an air of confidence that didn't tip into arrogance, and the kind of laugh you hear once and think, I want to make him laugh like that for the rest of my days. So when he proposed, I said yes with a heart so full that every other part of me felt weightless, like it was destiny. Emily, my best friend since high school, was the first person I told after Ryan slipped the ring on my finger. She and I had been inseparable from the moment she marched up to me at orientation, complaining about how the plastic chairs were going to ruin her brand new jeans. Emily was sharp-tongued, vivacious, and unapologetically honest in ways I often admired. We bonded over cheesy horror flicks and afternoons trying on each other's clothes. When she leapt into my arms at the news, I hugged her back just as tightly. Deep down, I had always assumed she'd be my maid of honor whenever I got married. She knew me in ways no one else did, my favorite foods, how to calm me down when I spiraled into anxiety, and the best times to push me out of my comfort zone. I never imagined those qualities might become weapons against me. My parents, too, were elated. They'd known Ryan's family for years. My father and Ryan's father were old fishing buddies who loved to tell the story of how they once caught a catfish the size of a toddler. My mother enjoyed hosting dinners for Ryan's family, always praising how polite and charming he was. I had grown up listening to them talk about what a stand-up guy Ryan turned out to be, how rare it was to see someone so committed to his job, yet so attentive to his partner. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but I trusted that the small disagreements we had were normal. In the grand scheme of things, Ryan seemed like the safe harbor I could anchor myself to. He knew my folks inside and out, and they adored him. Over the years, there was never any reason to suspect hidden truths swirling beneath the surface. Everything started shifting 3 months before the wedding. Emily began acting strangely distant. She'd cancel our meetups last minute, claiming work emergencies or exhaustion. Her text messages felt forced, short replies peppered with excuses. At first, I worried that she might be going through something personal. She'd struggled with bouts of depression in college, and I never wanted her to feel alone. But whenever I asked if something was wrong, she insisted it was just the stress of her demanding job. Meanwhile, Ryan was also spending more time away on late-night projects. I didn't think much of it because he'd always been career-focused, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't be silenced. Still, I brushed it off, giving them both the benefit of the doubt. I told myself this was probably the normal hectic swirl before a big event, and that soon everything would settle back into place. One evening, I found myself alone at my parents' house, flipping through old photo albums. My mother had left them on the kitchen table, presumably to reminisce about all the milestones leading up to the wedding. Pictures of Emily and me in Halloween costumes, of Ryan holding our neighbor's puppy, of family vacations on the lake. As I turned a page, something slipped out, a receipt from a small local motel. It was dated a week prior. Curiosity snagged me. I had no reason to connect it to anything suspicious, but that voice in my head roared to life. Why was a random motel receipt between the pages of a photo album? Who had put it there? I checked the date and time. It coincided with one of Ryan's supposed late-night projects. The occupant's name was scribbled, but the print was faded. It took me a moment to read it clearly. It read R. Hayes. My heart lurched. Ryan's last name was Hayes. At first, I rationalized that maybe his father or brother had rented a room for some reason, but they lived in town, with no obvious need for a motel. My mind raced. I called Ryan, half hoping he'd laugh it off as some bizarre coincidence. But my call went straight to voicemail. I started to panic, remembering how he and Emily had been so distant lately. I tried pushing the thought away. Accusing my fiancé and best friend of cheating seemed like an unthinkable betrayal of the trust we'd built. But sometimes, the unthinkable is exactly what's happening. I checked the motel's address and saw it was just off a highway exit near Emily's workplace. My stomach dropped. That night, I barely slept, my thoughts spiraling around the fear that the two people I trusted most were lying to me. In the morning, I decided to confront the issue head-on. I drove to Emily's apartment, unannounced. My plan was to gauge her reaction, see if her eyes darted away when I mentioned the motel. But she wasn't home. Her neighbor said she'd left early, an overnight bag slung over her shoulder. Anxiety clawed at me. I dialed her number and got the same dead-end voicemail as with Ryan. Feeling like I was in the middle of a surreal nightmare, I headed to my parents' place for some kind of clarity. My mother was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast. I placed the receipt on the table and waited for her response. She glanced at it, then up at me, her face blanching. That was all it took. One look at her expression, and I knew. She wasn't confused. She wasn't surprised. She was guilty of hiding something. I confronted her. She didn't deny it. My mother, in the trembling voice I'd only ever heard her use when she was severely disappointed in me, admitted that she knew Ryan and Emily had been meeting behind my back for months. According to her, it wasn't anything serious, just a moment of weakness that they both regretted. She tried to downplay it, as though a clandestine affair were a minor slip, like forgetting to pick up milk from the grocery store. I felt my hands shake, my vision blur with tears of betrayal. When I demanded to know who else knew, she faltered, refusing to meet my eyes. My father had known, my brother had known, even my aunt, who'd always been my confidant, had known. They had all decided it was best to keep it from me, not to ruin the wedding. They believed they were protecting me, or so they said. I left the house in a rage, unable to look at my mother any longer. Everything I had ever believed about family loyalty shattered in that kitchen. My father tried to follow me out, but I slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. I got in my car and drove aimlessly, tears streaming down my cheeks, a mixture of heartbreak and fury. I couldn't call Ryan or Emily. I didn't trust myself not to scream uncontrollably. Instead, I parked by the lake where we'd spent so many summers. Memories of us roasting marshmallows and laughing by the dock flickered through my mind like ghosts. I stayed there for hours, letting the day shift into twilight. By the time the sky turned a bruised purple, I'd resolved that I wouldn't let them see me broken. They wanted a wedding? They would get one, but on my terms. Vengeance would be mine. Over the next few days, I went through the motions of wedding preparations. Everyone kept expecting me to melt down, but I wore a mask of composure. My father approached me repeatedly, trying to explain how he had just wanted me to be happy, that he believed Ryan's mistake was in the past. I nodded politely, letting him think I was swallowing his rationale. Inside, I felt like a statue carved from cold stone, analyzing every detail. Emily attempted to reach out, leaving messages that ranged from tearful apologies to desperate pleas to see me in person. I ignored them. I wanted her to wonder what I knew, how much I had discovered. Ryan, meanwhile, acted like nothing was wrong. He brought flowers, asked about seating arrangements, and tried to kiss my cheek whenever I flinched away. The performance was nauseating. Still, I kept my silence, carefully planning my moment. The rehearsal dinner was set for a cozy Italian restaurant where both families and our closest friends were invited. I wore a modest navy dress, not wanting to overshadow my real spotlight moment that was yet to come. People smiled at me as I arrived, but their eyes flickered with nerves. My relatives tried to act normal. Some even complimented me on how calm I seemed. Emily was there, sitting at the far end of the table next to Ryan. Her face looked pale, her usual vivacious smile replaced by a forced twitch of her lips. Ryan greeted me with open arms, and I let him hug me, noticing the slight tremor in his embrace. My parents hovered nearby, exchanging worried glances. This was it, the final act before the truth would crack wide open. I took my seat at the head of the table, determined to keep everyone in suspense. After the first round of drinks, toasts began. My father raised his glass, wishing me and Ryan a lifetime of happiness. My mother chimed in with a story about how I'd always dreamed of a big wedding as a child. Ryan's mother shared a fond memory of him as a little boy, determined to marry the neighbor girl with daisies in her hair. Everyone laughed on cue, but tension hummed beneath the surface. I could see it in their stiff smiles. Emily's eyes darted to me every few seconds, as if waiting for my condemnation. Ryan reached for my hand, lacing his fingers with mine under the table. I let him, even squeezed back for effect, though the contact made my skin crawl. They were all in for a show tonight. I just wasn't sure if it would be the one any of them expected. But vengeance never arrives gently. I stood up, clearing my throat as the lights flickered gently overhead. The restaurant quieted. Every gaze turned to me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. This was the moment I'd rehearsed countless times in my head. I began by thanking everyone for their support, talking about how important family and friendship were. My voice shook with genuine emotion. I couldn't hide the heartbreak fueling every word. Then I turned to Emily, my voice catching in my throat. I told her how I cherished our years of closeness, how she had become like a sister to me. I saw tears pool in her eyes. She must have thought I was about to let bygones be bygones. But instead, I announced that I had discovered her affair with Ryan, that I knew all about the lies. A chorus of shocked gasps rose around the table. I felt alive. Emily choked on a sob, her face turning scarlet. Ryan jumped to his feet, sputtering denials that no one believed. The tension in the room exploded, relatives clamoring for an explanation. My father stood there, slack-jawed, while my mother pressed trembling fingers to her lips. At first, Emily tried to deny everything, but her feeble protest dissolved under the weight of my calm fury. I recounted how they'd hid at a motel, how my entire family had known but chose to keep me in the dark. I didn't scream or cry. My voice was low, resolute, the kind of rage that blisters the air. I told Ryan he could take his ring and shove it. Then I paused, letting the gravity of betrayal settle over everyone. The silence was deafening. This was my declaration that I would never forgive them, never move past their deceit. I reveled in their discomfort. And then my mother stood up, her eyes brimming with tears. She begged me to listen, her voice trembling. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might apologize, or at least acknowledge how horrendous it was to conspire in silence. But instead, she said she had something else to confess, something that would change everything. My heart hammered as she admitted that she'd had her own affair years ago and that my father was not my biological parent. A stunned hush fell across the room. I watched my father's face go ashen. Emily's shame-faced expression melted into sheer confusion. Ryan took a step back, probably relieved that the attention had shifted. I stood there, numb. My mother explained she had carried the secret for decades, terrified of destroying our family. She claimed her guilt over that might have influenced her decision to keep Ryan's affair hidden from me. I was speechless. My whole body felt disconnected, like I was an observer in someone else's nightmare. It occurred to me, in that charged moment, that everyone in this room had lied to me. My mother had lied about my paternity. My father had lied by omission. Or maybe he hadn't known either. Emily and Ryan had lied about their betrayal. Suddenly, the wedding seemed like the smallest detail in a vast tapestry of deceit. For a moment, I wondered if my father had known I wasn't his child all along. He looked shattered, tears gleaming in his eyes. Ryan stood there, hand half raised as if he wanted to comfort me but didn't dare. Emily's expression was a mix of regret and pity. The air felt thick enough to slice. Then, something inside me snapped. I refused to let anyone else control this narrative. My life was mine to reclaim. No more illusions. I turned to my father, my voice brittle. Did you know?" He opened his mouth, nothing but a croak escaping at first. Then he managed to say he had suspected something was off years ago, but my mother convinced him it was a baseless fear. The devastation in his face was palpable. Then I looked at my mother. She was sobbing, reaching out to me. I stepped back, my revulsion painfully clear. I told her that she had lost any claim to my sympathy when she conspired against me in my darkest hour. She tried to speak, but I raised my hand to silence her. No apologies could right this. I glanced at Ryan and Emily, two people I had trusted with my whole heart, only to be repaid with betrayal. The restaurant was dead silent, except for the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen. They all cowered quietly. I knew I had to make a clean break. First, I turned to Ryan and removed the engagement ring from my finger. Placing it in his palm, I told him we were finished. No ceremony, no happily ever after. He looked panicked, trying to mutter something about how it was just a mistake, that we could work through it. But I saw no remorse in his eyes, only fear of losing the future he had so carefully cultivated. Emily stood by, tears rolling down her cheeks. She stammered out an apology, but I cut her off. My resentment flared, the memory of our shared laughter now laced with venom. I told her that she was dead to me, that there was no coming back from this. My voice trembled, but not with sadness, rather with the rage that burned so hot it felt cold. I would bury my ruined past here. All eyes stayed on me. My father looked as if he wanted to speak, but the shock of my mother's revelation had gutted him. My mother reached for me, whispering that she was sorry, that she never intended to hurt me. Anger twisted in my chest, but I managed to tell her that I couldn't even look at her without seeing a lifetime of lies. I declared right then and there that I was leaving. The wedding was off, and I didn't know when, if ever, I'd be able to speak to any of them again. Some distant relative tried to calm me, but I brushed them away. With trembling steps, I walked toward the exit, the whispers and hushed cries swirling behind me. I felt betrayed beyond measure, but also strangely liberated, like a prisoner stepping into the sun after years of darkness. I refused to remain shackled by their falsehoods. I drove away from the restaurant, the cool night air slicing through my open window. My phone buzzed incessantly, calls from my mother, texts from Emily, voicemails from Ryan, but I ignored them all. I was done. In that whirlwind of betrayal, I discovered a seed of resilience. I didn't have a father, fiancé, or best friend I could trust anymore. Yet, for the first time, I felt a fierce sense of self-worth. No more illusions, no more dancing around other people's comfort. I found a motel off the highway, the same chain where Ryan and Emily had met in secret, and checked in alone. In that stark, impersonal room, I gazed at my reflection in the mirror. There were tears in my eyes and a searing pain beneath my ribs, but also a determined light. I still believed in love and family, but I'd forged them on my own terms. Strength flickered inside. I used to believe trust was an unbreakable bond, forged through love and tempered by the daily trials of a shared life. My name is Samuel Coleman, and 6 years ago, I married the woman I thought would be my partner in both sunshine and storms. Even though I'd had a complicated past involving a secret medical condition, I still believed we could navigate life together with honesty and devotion. I never expected that my marriage would unravel around a single, shattering revelation. The day my wife announced she was pregnant, even though I'd known for years I couldn't father children. The irony lays in how ordinary that day began. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails on my phone. She came in with a look of trembling excitement that I assumed was about a new project at work or maybe a spontaneous weekend getaway. Instead, she showed me a plastic stick and uttered those two words: "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed felt deafening, and I could feel my heart twist. I'd undergone a surgery in my early 20s that left me sterile, a fact I'd shared with her shortly after we got married. At first, I wanted to believe in miracles. Maybe the doctors made a mistake, or my condition wasn't as definitive as they claimed. But a quick, panicked trip to my old urologist confirmed the truth. There had been no error. My sterility was absolute and irreversible. Standing in the physician's office, I felt my stomach churn like I'd swallowed shards of glass. The child my wife carried could not be mine. The wave of disbelief collided with fury. I had confided everything to her, yet now I found myself on the wrong side of a cruel betrayal. By the time I got home, I felt numb, as though the walls of my reality had turned to vapor. She was there, bustling around the house, visibly excited. I asked her gently how she felt, hoping she might crack open and reveal the truth. She squealed about morning sickness and baby names, painting a cozy picture of our future family. My jaw tightened, but I nodded and pretended to share her joy. A part of me wanted to confront her outright, but another part recognized that what I needed was strategy, time to plan my next move. The first night after her announcement, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The streetlights cast shifting shapes on the walls, reminding me of ghosts. She was beside me, radiating a strange calm that I found infuriating. How could she lie so easily? How could I have misread the woman I married? The next morning, I decided to wait. I needed proof, solid evidence of her infidelity, because in our marriage, trust was once sacred. If I was going to enact vengeance, I wanted it to be undeniable, a reckoning built on irrefutable facts. I started paying closer attention to her schedule. She claimed she had new obligations at work, often coming home later than usual. On 2 occasions, she said she was visiting a friend who lived across town. Something about her behavior felt too rehearsed, as though she'd been planning these alibis for weeks. I installed a small app on her phone, one that secretly forwarded her text messages and call logs to me. I felt guilty, like I was crossing a boundary I'd never imagined. But betrayal demands desperate measures, and I no longer cared about boundaries. Within days, I discovered a number I didn't recognize, saved under an inconspicuous name, Sammy from marketing. For context, her name is Elise. She worked in the human resources department, so the marketing team was on a different floor. It seemed plausible enough that she might interact with them occasionally. Still, my gut told me that something was off. Late one night, while she was asleep, I opened her messaging app and found a conversation dripping with familiarity and inside jokes. They chatted about lunch plans and weekend getaways, none of which had ever involved me. As the weeks passed, their messages grew more intimate. I saw goodnight texts signed with little hearts, references to romantic dinners, and even discussions about the pregnancy. Reading those words stoked an anger so fierce, it felt like a physical force in my chest. She told him he should be more patient, that she needed to maintain appearances with me a bit longer. Each message sharpened my resolve. I had all the confirmation I needed. Elise was carrying another man's child, and she expected me to be none the wiser. I grew quieter around her, playing the role of a supportive, unsuspecting husband. Every time she mentioned the baby, I suppressed the urge to lash out. Instead, I feigned delight, offered back rubs, and cooked her favorite meals. Elise basked in the attention, while I calculated how best to dismantle her world. Some nights, I found myself trembling with a kind of cold, focused rage that I'd never experienced before. I realized that once innocence is shattered, there can be no going back. Forgiveness was out of the question, replaced by a craving for justice. While I continued to gather data, I also consulted a lawyer, discreetly. In the eyes of the law, a child conceived during a marriage is presumed to be the husband's unless proven otherwise. I had no intention of raising someone else's kid or getting stuck with child support payments down the road. My attorney advised me to wait until the child was born, then request a paternity test. But that route would have kept me tied to her for months, living under the same roof, enduring her lies. I wanted a more immediate sort of retribution. I started documenting every suspicious text, every date reference, every photo they exchanged. I kept screenshots of their phone calls, correlating them with her alleged business meetings or dinner with friends. Each piece of evidence became a stepping stone leading me toward a final confrontation. I wanted to ensure that when the moment came, Elise couldn't twist the narrative. There would be no illusions that this was some unfortunate accident or misguided fling. She was systematically deceiving me, weaving a fantasy life that cut me out entirely. I refused to be the oblivious husband any longer. One evening, I discovered her phone bill in the mail. I sat down at the dining table, scanning pages of calls and text logs. It was staggering how often she'd been in contact with her lover. The record highlighted entire weekends peppered with communications. She was even texting him while we were in the same room, just out of my line of sight. My pulse pounded as I realized I had spent entire days ignorant of this double life. That was my turning point. I could no longer stand by and let her orchestrate this charade. I took a week off work, citing family matters. In reality, I was orchestrating a calculated collapse of our marriage. I planned everything meticulously, from the confrontation to the exit strategy. I wasn't just going to leave her, I intended to expose her betrayal in a way she couldn't easily recover from. That might sound cruel, but any sympathy I once held was eclipsed by the burning knowledge that she was carrying another man's child and planned to pass it off as mine. The law might grant her certain protections, but I wanted to strike first. Part of my plan involved revealing her infidelity to her family and close friends, but only after I had confronted her face to face. I still felt a shred of decency, wanting to give her the chance to explain herself, though I couldn't fathom any justification that would repair what she'd broken. Also, I needed to ensure that I controlled the narrative before she spun a different story, painting me as a heartless husband who abandoned her during pregnancy. So I spent nights preparing a digital dossier, complete with timestamped screenshots, phone records, and any relevant emails. When everything was ready, I chose a Thursday evening for the confrontation. Elise arrived home, glowing with that irritating pregnancy aura she'd been flaunting. We had dinner in silence, the tension in the air almost crackling. Finally, I said I had something important to discuss. She placed her fork down and looked at me with cautious curiosity. I could see her mind racing, wondering if I'd discovered her secret or if I was about to bring up something else. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. It was time to end the deception. I began by calmly stating that I knew the baby wasn't mine. Her eyes flickered with panic before she tried to muster a laughable facade of confusion. I slid my phone across the table, showing her a photo of the text she'd exchanged with Sammy from marketing. Her face went pale. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes as she tried to formulate a lie, but there was no escape. I told her I'd known about my sterility all along, that the doctors had confirmed it to be irreversible. The truth lay bare between us. She sputtered excuses about confusion, about not being sure of the test results. Then she switched tactics, claiming it was a miracle, that maybe I wasn't entirely sterile. Her desperation was almost pitiful, but I felt no sympathy. I pressed her, demanding she admit whose child it was. Eventually, she broke down sobbing, whispering his name, Daniel. The revelation didn't shock me. I'd read it all in her messages. Still, hearing the words pour from her lips felt like being stabbed with a knife forged from every lie she'd ever told me. I stood up from the table, unable to bear her presence any longer. When she tried to touch me, I jerked away, telling her not to lay a finger on me. I made it clear we were done. She pleaded, insisted we could work things out. But her words fell on deaf ears. I told her I had evidence of everything, and I'd be forwarding it to my lawyer first thing in the morning. She turned ashen, realizing I wasn't bluffing. In that moment, I saw the hollow shell of the woman I once loved. I slept in the guest room that night, though slept is a generous term. Rage and heartbreak churned inside me, waging a silent war. I replayed every memory, our wedding vows, the times we laughed over trivial jokes, the future we had once envisioned. All of it felt like a sick joke now. Still, I felt a grim satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer swallowing my fury. I was acting on it, ensuring that she'd face the consequences of her choices. As the night dragged on, I realized I wasn't sad anymore. I was determined. Before dawn, I quietly packed a suitcase. I wasn't certain where I would go, but I knew I couldn't stay under the same roof. As I slipped out of the house, I left an envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside were copies of some of the incriminating evidence, along with a single sentence scrawled in black ink. I deserve better. That morning, I moved into a short-term rental apartment across town. From there, I contacted my lawyer, initiating the divorce process. Elise called me repeatedly, leaving tearful voicemails. I listened to none of them. Over the following weeks, my lawyer and I prepared for a confrontation in court. She guided me through the steps to demand a paternity test as soon as the baby was born. Financial matters were hashed out, and I was determined not to grant Elise any advantage. The realization that this woman had planned to anchor me with a child that wasn't mine only fueled my resolve. In my darker moments, I fantasized about humiliating her publicly, exposing her affair to everyone she cared about. I wanted her to feel the same sting of betrayal she inflicted on me. Eventually, I settled on a method that would serve as both closure and retribution. I scheduled a meeting with her parents. They had always treated me with kindness, but they deserved to know the truth. On a brisk Saturday afternoon, I arrived at their home unannounced. Her mother answered the door with a concerned smile, and her father looked up from the living room. I calmly explained the situation, showing them the messages, the phone records, and the undeniable proof of Elise's deceit. Their horror and disappointment were palpable. They apologized, tears forming in her mother's eyes. I told them I didn't come for sympathy, I came for the truth. They asked me about the future, about whether I'd consider reconciling. I told them firmly that there would be no reconciliation, no chance of forgiveness. Their daughter had crossed a line that shattered our marriage. I urged them to speak to Elise directly if they wanted more details. Then I left, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. I knew Elise would be mortified once she discovered I had preemptively exposed her betrayal to her own family. It was a small piece of payback. In the ensuing months, Elise tried everything to win me back. She left messages claiming she was confused, that she'd made a terrible mistake. She wrote lengthy emails describing how she still loved me, how we could raise the baby together, that we could find a new normal. I deleted them all without response. The divorce proceedings advanced, and we negotiated the division of our assets. I insisted on keeping the house, given my significant financial contributions. My lawyer filed motions to protect me from any responsibility for the unborn child, including future support obligations. Shortly before the baby was due, Daniel was forced to face the consequences as well. Elise's affair became public knowledge at her workplace, partly through a carefully placed anonymous email that contained some of the same evidence I'd gathered. Rumors circulated, and human resources launched an internal investigation. I heard from acquaintances that Daniel was reassigned to a different branch, effectively separated from Elise in a professional capacity. Their perfect little romance crumbled under the weight of scrutiny. I didn't shed a tear for either of them. They had built their relationship on lies, and lies have sharp edges. The day the baby was born, I received a text from Elise. It simply read, "He's here, please come." My chest tightened as I stared at the message. A swirl of conflicting emotions seized me: anger, pity, sadness, and a faint curiosity about this innocent child who had no say in any of this. Ultimately, though, I decided it was not my place to be there. I deleted the message and continued about my day. My lawyer later confirmed that Elise had listed Daniel as the father on the birth certificate. That was the final closure I needed. When the divorce was finalized, I felt an odd mix of relief and lingering anger. The settlement awarded me the house, as well as protected me from any financial obligations relating to the child. Elise moved out of town shortly afterward, presumably to try and salvage whatever pieces were left of her life. I heard rumors that Daniel stuck around for a bit, but eventually transferred again. Whether they ended up together or not, I didn't care. My focus was on rebuilding my life, rediscovering who I was without her shadow looming over me. In the months that followed, I underwent a transformation. I sought therapy to deal with the immense betrayal and to process the rage that had fueled me for so long. I filled my time with activities I had once abandoned: jogging in the park, cooking elaborate meals, even picking up a paintbrush for the first time in years. My heart was still scarred, but I learned that scars can sometimes serve as reminders of what we've overcome. If nothing else, I had the clarity of knowing I refused to be someone's fool ever again. To outsiders, it might appear as though I overreacted, that I could have handled things with more compassion. But compassion dies a swift death when your entire life is built on a lie. I gave Elise every opportunity to be honest about my sterility before we married, and she knew exactly what she was doing when she cheated on me. She tried to pin a child on me that wasn't mine. In my book, that crosses any line imaginable. I took my revenge in a way that ensured I wouldn't remain a victim. Some might call it harsh, but I call it survival. Occasionally, I still dream about our time together, the happier moments when I was blind to her deception. I wake up feeling a pang of loss, followed quickly by gratitude that I escaped a toxic web. Every day, I remind myself of the lesson. Trust is precious, and when it's violated, you have every right to walk away without forgiveness. My story might not have a fairy tale ending, but it has truth, and that's more valuable to me than any facade of happily ever after. The day Elise claimed she was pregnant marked the end of one life and the beginning of another, where I discovered the strength to stand up for myself. Even though the price was steep, I don't regret paying it. If someone dares betray you so profoundly, you owe them nothing. Not kindness, not pity, and certainly not a second chance. That's the raw, unvarnished truth I had to learn, and in the end, it set me free. In the aftermath, I discovered that real power lies in refusing to be a casualty of someone else's gross dishonesty. I learned that self-worth can triumph over betrayal, that boundaries protect the soul, and that walking away can be an act of profound courage. My heart is no longer naive, but it is stronger, and I treasure that above all. I never imagined fate had such a twisted sense of humor, but then again, life rarely unfolds the way we expect. My name is Paul, and I had just turned 30 when everything started to change for me. It began on a cold morning in early December, the day I discovered I'd won $1 million in the state lottery. I'd bought the ticket on a whim, more out of habit than genuine belief that I'd ever win anything significant. All I'd hoped for was a few bucks to cover the next round of tickets or maybe a modest dinner. When the clerk scanned my ticket and his eyes widened, I half expected him to announce some minor amount like $100. Instead, he stared at me and stuttered, "I think you just hit the jackpot." I stood there in shock, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear him confirm it. Thoughts flooded my mind: student loans, credit card bills, the leaky roof in my small rented house. This win was life-changing money, and I felt excitement mixed with panic, a sense that this much luck would inevitably come with consequences. I never realized how right I would be. I'd been single for almost a year by then, ever since my ex Miranda and I split under bitter circumstances. We had grown apart, but it wasn't the sort of drifting you hear about in polite anecdotes. She wanted marriage, children, stability, and I wanted to breathe without feeling smothered by constant arguments. The day I found out she'd been casually seeing someone else while we were still together, I packed up my things and left her apartment in the middle of a storm. We never spoke again, and I believed our paths would never cross in any meaningful way. Winning that million felt surreal. I told no one except my best friend Tom, who was more excited than I was, rattling off ideas about investments, traveling, and perhaps a new car. I was cautious though. $1 million after taxes wasn't quite the endless fortune people imagined, yet it was enough to alter my life if I handled it well. I planned to pay off my debts, fix my home, and put the rest away in a reliable fund. Then came the phone call from a lawyer's office, informing me that someone intended to serve me with a lawsuit. My stomach twisted when the secretary on the line said she represented a certain Ms. Miranda Phillips. The name echoed in my mind like a cursed incantation I thought I'd banished. I asked why she was contacting me, but the woman on the phone was tight-lipped, suggesting I await official paperwork. Curiosity gnawed at me, but dread gnawed deeper. What possible reason could Miranda have to sue me now after nearly a year of silence? The timing, so soon after my lottery win, felt like more than a coincidence. The memory of her betrayal surged back, making my hands tremble. It was another week before anything else happened, enough time for my imagination to run wild. Would she accuse me of something ridiculous, like emotional distress? Maybe claim shared property or some debt? I called Tom to vent, and he laughed, urging me to stay calm. "She can't take money from you without proof," he said. I nodded, but a lingering sense of foreboding refused to fade. Then, just when I thought I might be overreacting, a courier arrived at my door. The envelope bore Miranda's name, and my heart thundered as I tore it open and read the contents. She claimed paternity. My ex was pregnant, 6 months along, according to the attached medical form, and insisted the child was mine. It felt entirely absurd, especially since I was certain I'd never slept with her in that time frame. Our breakup was final nearly 12 months ago, but there was a sharper sting hidden in the folds of those papers. She wanted a significant portion of my lottery winnings as child support, and she threatened to drag me through court if I refused. My head spun. Did she think I was an idiot? I was also harboring a secret. I was infertile. That was the kicker. Something Miranda never knew because I'd been diagnosed only a few months after we ended things. A congenital condition, the doctors explained, left me with virtually no chance of fathering a child naturally. I'd been crushed at first, but the shock of that revelation had faded as I moved on. Now, I held evidence of her deception. She claimed the baby was mine for one purpose: money. Part of me wanted to lash out immediately, but I knew better than to react impulsively. I needed a plan, something that wouldn't just protect me, but destroy her lie. I made an appointment with my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Danielle today. She had steered me through some minor legal matters before, and I trusted her discretion. After reviewing Miranda's documents, Danielle pursed her lips. "This is a blatant money grab," she said, her voice tight with anger. "But she's got a doctor's note, a timeline, enough to make trouble. We'll need proof she's lying." That was when I revealed my infertility. Danielle's eyes widened. A slow, satisfied smile formed. "Well, that changes everything. We'll not only defend, we'll go on the offensive. Are you ready for a fight?" Miranda scheduled a meeting between our legal teams. Danielle insisted I attend, saying it would be best to keep a cool demeanor. When I walked into the conference room, Miranda was already there, looking noticeably pregnant. She wore a smug expression, barely masking her contempt. I felt a flash of old anger, but I swallowed it, reminding myself that anger wouldn't serve me here. The introductions were curt, and then Miranda's lawyer, a gray-haired man named Richardson, began outlining their demands. He spoke of Miranda's undue financial burden and how I must accept paternal responsibility. My pulse thrummed with tension. Danielle wasted no time. "We will require a paternity test," she said firmly. "Until then, my client disputes any claim of fatherhood." Miranda's expression stiffened. She tried to appear wounded, but I recognized the flicker of panic. Richardson argued that a test might harm the unborn child, or that we should wait until after the baby's birth to confirm paternity. Danielle shook her head, emphasizing the importance of immediate clarity. Miranda finally agreed, albeit reluctantly, to a non-invasive prenatal test. I stayed silent, letting my lawyer do the talking, waiting for the trap to spring on Miranda's carefully crafted lie. Outside the conference room, Miranda confronted me. "Why are you doing this?" she hissed, lower lip trembling. "You know this is your child. Why won't you just take responsibility?" Her theatrics might have convinced anyone else, but not me. I stared at her without a trace of pity, recalling the night I discovered her cheating. She had shattered every piece of trust I had in her. Now she dared to ask for empathy? "I'm not the father," I said calmly. "Stop pretending." Her eyes flashed with anger and she stormed off. Danielle placed a hand on my shoulder, smirking slightly. 2 weeks later, the test results arrived. As expected, they showed a 0% probability of paternity. Miranda's ruse was laid bare. She must have been counting on me not asking for a test or somehow refusing to challenge her claim. Perhaps she assumed I'd be too ashamed or afraid to reveal my infertility. But here we were, with evidence that I wasn't the father. I felt vindicated, but furious that she'd tried to manipulate me like this. Danielle advised me to let the court process proceed so we could countersue for damages if Miranda refused to drop her case. Miranda's reaction was swift. She cried foul, accusing me of tampering with the test. Her lawyer tried to argue procedural errors, but the lab's credibility was solid. The judge granted a motion for a court-ordered test at a different facility. The result was the same. I wasn't the father. Meanwhile, rumors started spreading in Miranda's social circle. Tom heard from mutual acquaintances that the real father was a colleague of hers from work, a married man with children of his own. Suddenly, her desperate scheme made twisted sense. She sought a scapegoat, someone with money to bankroll her upcoming motherhood. But vengeance demands more than just denying someone's false claim. I wanted her to pay and humiliation for every sleepless night, every shred of anxiety she caused. Danielle filed a countersuit for malicious prosecution and emotional distress. We listed the ways Miranda's false accusations had endangered my reputation, my finances, and my mental well-being. Miranda's lawyer tried to settle quietly, but Danielle was adamant. We wanted a public apology or a court victory. Word reached me that Miranda was furious, insisting she'd done nothing wrong, doubling down on her lies. It only hardened my resolve to see her scheme crumble. Tom was beside me throughout. He insisted I not let anger consume me, yet I saw the righteous spark in his eyes when I described our countersuit. "She messed with the wrong person," he told me over beers one night, shaking his head in disbelief. Part of me felt guilty taking pleasure in her downfall, but then I remembered the pain she had inflicted. My trust had been shattered once, and she was trying to exploit me again. This wasn't just about me, either. If she got away with this, what message would it send? No, she had to lose. Court proceedings dragged on for weeks. Miranda's belly grew, and so did her desperation and fear. She claimed I had threatened her, that I was vindictive. She even attempted to smear me with half-truths about our past relationship, painting herself as a victim. Fortunately, Danielle systematically dismantled those lies. We presented medical records, including my infertility diagnosis. The judge listened intently, showing little sympathy for Miranda's contradictory statements. It was clear she was cornered, her story unraveling under scrutiny. Each hearing made it more obvious that she'd orchestrated this entire charade to extract money, but she refused to surrender quietly. The day the verdict was announced, I arrived at the courthouse early. The air felt charged with tension. Miranda sat at the defendant's table, eyes downcast. Richardson looked grim. Danielle delivered our final arguments with precision, highlighting the malicious intent, the falsified claims, and the emotional toll on me. The judge spoke slowly, summarizing the evidence and concluding that Miranda's claim of paternity was completely baseless. She was found liable for my legal fees and a modest sum in damages. I exhaled, a weight lifting from my chest. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that her punishment was too light. Miranda glared at me as we left the courtroom. Tears stained her cheeks, but there was no remorse in her expression. She approached, ignoring Richardson's attempts to pull her away. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what it's like," she spat. "I did what I had to do. I'm alone, and you have everything." Her words echoed with resentment, as though I was responsible for her choices. I stared back, unflinching. "You've made your bed," I said quietly. She muttered a curse and turned away. In that moment, I realized she would never truly regret anything. After the court victory, I tried returning to normal life. My debts were paid, and I invested most of the lottery winnings. Yet, I couldn't forget the chill of Miranda's threat. Tom urged me to move on, but I felt I needed to ensure she couldn't hurt me again. Danielle assured me that with the legal judgment in my favor, Miranda's options were limited. Still, I heard rumors she was desperate for cash, that the baby's real father had backed off, leaving her alone and financially strained. Part of me felt pity, but another part remembered pity was a weakness. I learned she was living in a shabby apartment on the outskirts of town, barely making rent. A mutual friend, always partial to gossip, mentioned Miranda might have to give the child up for adoption if her situation worsened. My immediate reaction was an indifferent shrug. She had tried to drag me into a nightmare for money. Now she faced the consequences of her betrayal and decisions. However, a sliver of humanity nagged at me. I wasn't heartless. But then I recalled her sneer in the courtroom, her refusal to admit wrongdoing. Sympathy felt misplaced, so I pushed it aside. Months passed. I got a promotion at work, celebrated with Tom, and even started dating again. A coworker named Alexis who brought laughter and warmth back into my days. Life felt stable, almost peaceful. Then, out of nowhere, Miranda called. Her voice was shaky and she sounded on the verge of tears. She asked to meet, insisting it was important. Every instinct told me to hang up, but curiosity, or perhaps a lingering sense of closure, prompted me to agree. We arranged to meet at a neutral spot, a diner near the highway. I steeled myself for whatever scheme she had. She arrived looking exhausted, her face pale. I noticed she was no longer pregnant. A pang of surprise hit me. She must have given birth. Tentatively, I asked if the baby was healthy. She nodded but said little else. After an awkward silence, she said, "I need your help." I nearly laughed out loud. The audacity was staggering. Yet I stayed. I let her talk. She explained the real father had abandoned her entirely, that she was struggling to pay medical bills, baby expenses, rent. I listened, unmoved. Finally, she said, "Paul, please, I'm desperate. I'll do anything. Just help me." My initial reaction was cold disbelief. Did she really expect me, the man she tried to con, to rescue her from the mess she created? But there was a twisted sense of satisfaction in hearing her plea. I could have gloated, demanded apologies, or humiliations. Instead, I quietly asked, "Why should I help you?" Her eyes shone with tears. She muttered about our history, about how we once loved each other. I shook my head, remembering her betrayal. "You're looking for a check," I said, my voice steady. "I'm not your solution, and I'm certainly not going to save you." Her tears turned to anger. She accused me of cruelty, of failing to see how desperate she was. I reminded her she'd tried to pin her child on me for money. She fired back that she had no other options, that I should understand how scary it was to be alone with a newborn. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it clashed with the memory of standing in court, her lies laid bare. She demanded I at least offer something for the baby's sake, but I refused. "That child is not my responsibility," I said, rising to leave the table. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. I pulled away, reminding her that I owed her nothing. My mind whirled as I left the diner. A small part of me felt unsettled, but I pushed it down. She had burned every bridge between us. I wasn't going to rebuild them just because she'd realized the cost of her actions. Back in my car, I trembled, not from fear, but from the finality of it all. I had given her a chance to speak, and all she wanted was money once again. Days later, I heard she'd shown up drunk at my workplace, causing a scene in the parking lot. Security escorted her away before she could reach my office. She left voicemails, alternating between sobbing pleas and furious threats. Alexis grew concerned, suggesting I consider a restraining order. Danielle agreed. We filed the paperwork swiftly, presenting evidence of her escalating harassment. The court mercifully granted it, forbidding Miranda from contacting me. I felt a bleak sense of déjà vu, as though we were trapped in an endless cycle. But this time, I had the means to keep her at a distance. I wish I truly could say that was the end. 3 months passed without incident, and I hoped Miranda had finally simply moved on. Then came news that she'd been arrested for public intoxication and assaulting a bartender. She'd lost custody of her baby to social services. It was a tragedy, but also the ultimate consequence of her spiraling choices. A friend asked if I felt responsible, if I regretted not helping. The answer was simple: no. She made her bed, and every time she had a chance to salvage her life, she chose deception. I couldn't pity her anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I painfully wonder if things could have been different if she'd never betrayed me. Could we have worked through our issues? Maybe, but that possibility died the moment she chose deceit over honesty. My life moved forward. Alexis and I grew closer, talking about our future. I kept investing my winnings responsibly, ignoring the part of me that wanted to splurge recklessly. The $1 million I'd won was a blessing, yes, but also a curse that revealed how greed can twist a person. Miranda's downfall was self-inflicted. I just refused to be her victim one more time. It's been a year since all this concluded. I've learned the fragile nature of trust, how easily it can be shattered by betrayal. I've also learned to stand my ground, refusing to let guilt or pity sway me when someone crosses the line. Miranda's fate remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that greed and deceit lead only to ruin. I'd be lying if I said I never look over my shoulder expecting some last desperate ploy. But each day, I live my life free from her manipulation, secure in the knowledge that I chose to protect myself, and I chose rightly. I remember the day I discovered my wife's betrayal as vividly as if it happened just last night. I woke up early, unsuspecting, and brewed a pot of coffee in our cramped but cozy kitchen. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother Peter, whose success had always cast a shadow over my life. I opened it, expecting a mundane question about our family gathering. Instead, I found a series of photos that would shatter my world. In them, my wife, Elaine, clung to his arm like an adoring partner, looking at him with a devotion reserved for spouses. At first, I thought it was a cruel prank orchestrated by Peter, who was known for his twisted sense of humor. But then I noticed the timestamp on each image, confirming they had been taken just days earlier. My heart pounded so hard that I worried it might burst. Elaine was supposed to be visiting her parents in another state at the time, yet here she was, draped in designer clothes I knew I hadn't bought her, smiling unabashedly at my own flesh and blood. The shock soon boiled into rage, and I felt my vision blur with utter disbelief. I dialed Elaine's phone number with trembling fingers, but she didn't answer. My thoughts spun in rapid circles as I wondered how long this affair had been going on and why neither of them had bothered to hide it properly. That night, I confronted her after she finally returned home. She reeked of expensive perfume, the kind Peter often flaunted as his latest gift. When I demanded explanations, she offered a flimsy excuse about meeting old friends. Rage pulsed behind my eyes. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed my fury, determined to gather more proof before taking decisive action. In the weeks that followed, I became a reluctant detective in my own marriage. Every time Elaine left the house, I tracked her whereabouts as discreetly as possible, combing through bank statements, phone bills, and social media posts. The more I uncovered, the more the pieces fell into place. My brother's wealth had always dazzled her, and now it appeared she saw me as little more than a stepping stone to a grander life. Late one evening, I confronted Peter at a local bar. I remember his arrogant grin as he told me Elaine deserved a better man than me. That night, I stormed out of the bar with my head spinning and my chest tight. Peter had always been the favored son, the golden child who could do no wrong. My parents endlessly praised his ambition and charm, leaving me feeling perpetually overshadowed. His success, of course, was always flaunted. A lavish condo in the city, luxury cars, and enough disposable income to indulge every whim. Now, I felt like a fool for ever inviting him into my home, for believing the polite smiles he offered when we gathered for birthdays or holidays. This betrayal burned hotter than white-hot fire. Elaine continued her charade for months, playing the role of the dutiful wife when she was home and slipping away whenever Peter beckoned. I tried to preserve my sanity by focusing on my job at a modest marketing firm, but even there, I felt haunted by the knowledge of what was happening behind my back. Some nights, I fantasized about confronting them both with undeniable evidence, or perhaps packing up and leaving without a word. Yet a stubborn part of me refused to surrender my life so easily, as though acknowledging defeat would hand them comprehensive total victory over me. I planned my revenge with a methodical, deliberate precision I never knew I possessed. If Elaine and Peter wanted a life together, I would make sure it came with a bitter aftertaste. I collected screenshots, saved messages, and even recorded phone calls whenever I could. I discovered details about Peter's questionable business practices, risky investments, backdoor deals, and mounting debts he tried to conceal. His outward display of wealth was a fragile facade. Late at night, I pored over every snippet of information, imagining the day I would bring his empire crashing down. I wanted them both to feel utterly ruined. The opportunity for vengeance presented itself when I overheard Peter bragging about a major partnership on the horizon. He was courting a new investor with deep pockets, someone who had the power to expand his business exponentially. If the deal went through, he would become even wealthier, likely whisking Elaine off to exotic locations, leaving me with the tatters of a broken marriage. I wasn't willing to let that happen. Through a mutual acquaintance, I arranged a secret meeting with the prospective investor. By then, I had ample documentation that exposed Peter's financial instability and his shady, manipulative business tactics. I showed the investor every lie concealed behind Peter's polished persona, revealing unpaid loans, a string of lawsuits quietly settled, and employees who accused him of exploitation. The investor listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking for more specifics. I provided dates, figures, and emails that demonstrated just how precarious Peter's operation was. By the end of the meeting, the investor's confidence in Peter had clearly evaporated. He thanked me for my honesty and hinted that he might still invest, just not with my brother. As I walked away, I felt the first flush of satisfaction. My plan was in swift motion. Within a week, Peter's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Rumors spread that his major investor had pulled out and other potential partners grew skittish. He scrambled to do damage control, but I'd made sure to leak just enough information to spark further scrutiny. Articles popped up online questioning the legitimacy of his business model. Employees grew uneasy, some even quitting before the ship could fully sink. Through all of it, Elaine stood by his side. Part of me fumed with jealousy, but I reminded myself that her loyalty was more about money than love. Their downfall was rapidly nearing. Then came the day Peter announced his company's bankruptcy. I heard it through a friend who worked in finance, confirming that Peter's debts had spiraled out of control. Overnight, his house of cards collapsed. He lost his penthouse, his prized car, and his fancy office downtown. Elaine's social media went quiet, no more photos of lavish dinners or glitzy soirees. I imagined her dismay, knowing she'd hitched herself to a sinking ship. Part of me wondered whether she'd return, asking for another chance. The thought both disgusted me and stirred a cruel anticipation within my heart, fueling my vengeance further. Sure enough, she showed up on my doorstep one rainy afternoon, her eyes swollen from crying. She pleaded for a chance to explain, stumbling through apologies about how she'd been seduced by wealth and promises of a luxurious life. Her hair clung to her cheeks and she trembled from the cold. I felt a surge of triumph, a sense of retribution for every sleepless night she had caused me. Yet I kept my face neutral, ushering her inside with feigned compassion. She sank to her knees, tears streaming, promising she was done with Peter forever. I simply watched, silently unblinking. She babbled about regret, claiming she had never stopped loving me. Each sentence she uttered reeked of desperation, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. I had dreamed of this moment, her admission of wrongdoing, her humiliation laid bare. Now that it was happening, a strange calm settled over me. I thought about how I'd once adored her, how I'd trusted her enough to share my every hope and fear. A flicker of that old love threatened to surface, but I forced it down. Betrayal erodes love, and my wounds were far too deep to truly ever possibly forgive. I told her to leave, stating firmly that our marriage was beyond salvage. She sobbed, clutching at my pant leg, spouting claims of devotion. Her tears no longer moved me. Where were they when she was off with Peter, sipping champagne and wearing his gifts? My heart had hardened, forging a shield from every lie she told. I pulled her up from the floor and walked her to the door, ignoring her pleas. The rain outside mirrored her despair. As she stood on the threshold, I reminded her that she had chosen him when I was still giving her everything. She left, and I felt the silence of the house wrap around me like a shroud. I had anticipated feeling victorious, but a hollow ache settled in my chest. Although I refused to regret my decision, I realized that revenge seldom arrives without cost. My life had revolved around proving her infidelity, orchestrating my brother's downfall, and feeding the anger that sustained me. Now, with both of them cast aside, I confronted a gaping void. Part of me questioned whether I could ever trust again, or if my heart would remain barricaded behind these walls forever. Still, no forgiveness remained. In the following days, Elaine texted and called relentlessly, flooding my inbox with lengthy apologies. I ignored each message, occasionally skimming just enough to confirm she had nothing new to offer but regret and self-pity. My brother, meanwhile, reached out only once, sending a brief text blaming me for his collapse. The irony was laughable. He'd destroyed himself through arrogance and deception. I watched from a distance as his life unraveled further, with creditors seizing assets and former allies refusing to help. Whatever fleeting concern I felt was smothered by the memory of his betrayal. I owed him absolutely nothing. I decided to change the locks and box up the remnants of Elaine's belongings. Each item felt like a ghost of our former life. Photographs from trips, her favorite sweater, the perfume that once made my heart flutter. I tossed them into cardboard boxes without lingering. The ring she left behind glinted under the overhead light, mocking me with its broken promises. I placed it in an envelope, intending to mail it back to her, but a flicker of spite made me pause. Instead, I slipped it into a drawer, letting it serve as a deep reminder of her betrayal. Work became my refuge, a place where I could bury myself in tasks and ignore the stinging emptiness at home. My performance soared, ironically fueled by bitterness and heartbreak. Colleagues noticed my unrelenting focus, praising my dedication. I accepted promotions and raises with a dispassionate nod. Meanwhile, I caught whispers of Elaine attempting to rebuild her life, couch surfing with friends or relatives. Peter, stripped of his assets, moved to a small apartment in a less affluent part of town. Neither of them found the dream they had chased so recklessly. I couldn't muster sympathy. My heart had no leftover mercy. I sometimes caught sight of Elaine around the neighborhood. She avoided my eyes, clearly ashamed. Part of me relished her discomfort, recalling how she'd flaunted her betrayal without remorse. I continued to compile evidence of Peter's unethical actions, sending anonymous tips to regulatory agencies. My brother's life was in a tailspin, and I felt no desire to halt his crash. This was his reckoning for stepping on me, for taking what was mine. Strangely, each success in my covert war left me feeling emptier than before. Vengeance was a hollow feast, yet I couldn't stop devouring every bitter remaining morsel. As the months passed, my anger cooled into a distant ember. I began to question how much of myself I had sacrificed for revenge. I had severed ties with Elaine, irreparably demolished Peter's business, and erected towering walls around my heart. I asked myself whether true victory meant annihilating others or finding peace in my own life. Initially, I shrugged off such thoughts, deeming them weakness. However, late at night, I felt the echoes of love and sorrow swirl around me. The man who believed in loyalty and devotion was truly gone, replaced by someone who refused all second chances. My parents eventually discovered the truth. They tried to intervene, urging me to reconcile with my brother. They reasoned that family bonds should surpass any betrayal, that forgiveness was the only way to heal. But they hadn't witnessed the photos, the nights I lay awake consumed by heartbreak, the gut-wrenching realization that my own brother had stolen my wife. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. I told them I'd never speak to Peter again, nor would I allow Elaine back into my life. Their disappointment stung, but I clung to my resolve. Some transgressions can never truly be atoned for. I focused on building a future untethered from the past. I sought therapy, not to forgive or forget, but to understand why their betrayal cut so deeply. The therapist encouraged me to explore my childhood, the long-standing rivalry with Peter, the insecurities I carried into adulthood. It was a painful process, revealing scars I had pretended didn't exist. Gradually, I learned that letting go of rage didn't mean absolving those who wronged me. It simply meant reclaiming my energy. The quest for revenge had dominated my life. I refused to let it continue shaping my destiny or devouring my soul. Time passed, and I found myself on the cusp of a fresh start. I sold the house where memories of Elaine still lurked in every corner. Moving into a new apartment felt like shedding an old skin. My therapist suggested I journal, so I wrote down every hateful thought, every bitter recollection. Then I tore up the pages and tossed them away. It felt ceremonial, a small step toward healing. Though I remained resolute that neither Peter nor Elaine deserved my forgiveness, I no longer yearned to see their suffering. The ache persisted, but its sharpness had begun to dull. One afternoon, I ran into Elaine at a local grocery store. She looked exhausted, her once radiant smile extinguished. She tried to avoid me, but fate positioned us in the same aisle. She uttered a tentative greeting, and I nodded in acknowledgement. In her eyes, I glimpsed remnants of guilt and longing, but I offered no comfort. Instead, I recalled the crucial lesson I had learned. Betrayal leaves permanent scars. After an awkward pause, she hurried away, carrying a basket of budget groceries. I stood there, unmoved, my mind drifting to a future where her presence no longer haunted me. Later that week, a mutual acquaintance informed me that Peter had fallen ill. Stress, debt, and isolation had worn him down, leaving him nearly destitute. There was a time I might have felt pity, but the memory of his sneer, the pictures of him with Elaine, kept my compassion at bay. I wondered if he ever regretted his choices, if he realized he had traded our bond for a fleeting taste of triumph. If so, he would find no solace in me. Some might call it cruel to turn away from family, but pain taught me the limits of loyalty. I continued therapy and discovered renewed passions. I started painting, losing myself in splashes of color that allowed me to process emotions beyond words. My nights were no longer haunted by visions of vengeance. Instead, I dreamed of new experiences waiting just beyond my comfort zone. Occasionally, I still felt a pang when a stray memory of Elaine crept in, or a wave of anger flared at Peter's name. But those moments were fewer, and their intensity had waned. I recognized that my journey wasn't about mending old bridges, but constructing a self too strong to be shattered again. Months later, I received a letter from Elaine, forwarded from my old address. It was handwritten, pages smudged with tears or rain. She confessed she was leaving the city, hoping to find a fresh start somewhere else. There was an apology, full of contrition, but also a request. She wanted to meet before she left, to give me proper closure. I stared at her words, my heart remarkably steady. I decided not to reply. Our story was over, our bond irrevocably broken. My closure had come the day I turned her away. Nothing more needed to be said or done. Meanwhile, Peter's health declined, though the precise details were murky. Some said it was an autoimmune condition, others guessed it was the toll of stress and unwise habits. My parents tried again to intervene, pleading with me to visit him in the hospital. They believed that if we reconciled, perhaps he might find a spark of hope. But I remembered his mocking grin, the triumphant glint in his eyes when he claimed Elaine deserved better than me. I had no compassion left for the man who betrayed my trust. I would not stand at his bedside, feigning brotherly devotion. As the year drew to a close, I looked back on my journey with a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. I had survived heartbreak and orchestrated my betrayer's downfall. Yet I had also lost parts of myself along the way: innocence, faith, and the capacity to believe unconditionally in another person. In their place, I found resilience, self-reliance, and an unwavering understanding of my own worth. I no longer needed their remorse, nor did I crave their suffering. My life was my own, unburdened by illusions. If this was what it meant to move on, I embraced it fully. In a final twist, I discovered that Peter had named me in his will. The lawyer's call came unexpectedly, informing me that my brother, in his last weeks, had bequeathed everything he had left. Anger surged at his audacity, but curiosity drove me to the reading. There was little money, only debts, and a handwritten note. "I'm sorry." For a moment, I felt the weight of what could have been had he chosen loyalty over greed. Then I left the lawyer's office without claiming a cent. I owed him no absolution. My path lay ahead, untarnished, and ultimately mine alone. I was 17 years old when my sister Serena looked me straight in the eyes and called me a thief. I can picture the strained lines on her face, the trembling in her voice, and the flicker of triumph in her eyes as our parents turned their gaze from her to me. She was 2 years older, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who had never once been questioned. That day, she made sure it was me who was questioned. By everyone. The entire living room fell silent, and the clock ticked as I tried to defend myself. I had never stolen anything in my life, but my frantic explanations met only stern disbelief. My parents, dignified and proud, refused to entertain my pleas. They demanded proof of my innocence, which I could not provide because the money Serena claimed had gone missing was nowhere to be found. By the time I realized she had hidden it in my dresser drawer, it was too late. The discovery was the final nail in my coffin. Dad's face hardened, Mom wept quietly, and Serena acted as if she were the wounded party. I knew I had lost their trust forever. I remember packing my belongings in a worn suitcase, stuffing shirts and pants with trembling hands. No matter how forcefully I shoved them inside, my sense of betrayal could not be contained. Anger and devastation churned in my gut, but my parents offered no consolation. Mom refused to look at me, her tears a silent condemnation. Dad handed me a few bills and told me to make something of myself. The irony was piercing. I was labeled a thief, yet he was still giving me money, as if that would purchase my compliance or my silence. I left without goodbyes. I found a cramped room in a rundown boarding house on the other side of town. The landlady didn't care about my past, she only cared about receiving rent on time. I spent the last of Dad's money on that month's payment, a few groceries, and bus fare. My first nights there were unbearable. I lay on a creaking bed, staring at water-stained walls, replaying Serena's accusation in my head until sleep claimed me. Each morning, I woke feeling both enraged and hollow. My sister had orchestrated my downfall, and nobody questioned her story. I vowed I would return stronger. My path to stability was neither swift nor easy. I washed dishes in a diner, swept floors in a community center, and carried boxes in a warehouse just to scrape by. Every menial job felt like a blow to my pride, but I accepted them without complaint. Pride wouldn't feed me or keep a roof over my head. Days turned into months, and eventually, I saved enough to enroll in a local college's evening classes. It was there I discovered my aptitude for computer programming. With that, a glimmer of possibility appeared, lighting a distant road toward redemption and maybe revenge. I immersed myself in coursework, soaking up every line of code like it might reshape my destiny. Each lesson was a brick in the foundation I was building, one that would stand firm against any storm Serena might hurl at me. My classmates never suspected my tumultuous past. I presented myself as just another working student. Late nights found me hunched over a secondhand laptop, eyes burning as I wrestled with logic puzzles and programming challenges. I told myself that if I became exceptional, if I transcended my humble beginnings, then nobody would ever doubt me again. Slowly, determination replaced my despair. As time passed, I found a part-time position at a small tech startup, handling data entry and minor coding tasks. It didn't pay much, but it granted me a foothold in a world where skill trumped rumor. My supervisor admired my dedication, occasionally slipping me additional responsibilities. Each success was a quiet triumph, the antithesis of the shame Serena's accusation had inflicted. Meanwhile, I monitored my family from afar, scouring social media and overhearing scraps of gossip from mutual acquaintances. My parents never reached out, but I never expected them to. Their silence fueled my resolve rather than weakening it. 5 years slipped by in increments of relentless work and unwavering ambition. I completed my degree with honors, then landed a more substantial job at a medium-sized software firm. Life began to feel almost normal, except for the gaping wound that refused to close. Thoughts of my sister festered, but I forced myself to wait. Patience became my ally. I refused to act on raw emotion. Instead, I thrived in my new environment, attracting the notice of key managers. With each promotion, I banked not just money, but also credibility. The next time I faced Serena, I would not flinch. News of Serena's engagement reached me through an old neighbor who still exchanged holiday cards with my mother. The moment I heard her fiancé's name, Tristan, I felt a pang. We had attended the same high school. I recalled him as a decent, if somewhat naive, individual who excelled in sports but struggled academically. The neighbor mentioned a grand wedding planned at a local country club. I felt my heart pound as a swirl of conflicting emotions overcame me. Part of me wanted to crash that wedding just to see Serena's expression, but another part reminded me I had to be strategic. I remained silent for months, quietly gathering pieces of Serena's new life. I discovered she had switched jobs twice, each time under suspicious circumstances. From social media, I gleaned that Tristan traveled frequently for work, leaving Serena with ample free time. Through a friend of a friend, I learned Serena enjoyed nights out with a crowd that included one particular man named Derek, who appeared frequently in her photos. The more I uncovered, the more certain I became that Serena was repeating her old pattern of deception. I decided to keep digging, determined to find undeniable proof of her infidelity. Technology was my ally. I gained access to public records, cross-referenced addresses, and ran background checks on Derek. He was a bartender with a sketchy financial history, rumored to be an opportunist who latched onto people with money. My sister, with her flair for drama and apparent insecurity, was an easy mark. I scrolled through her online photo albums, spotting Derek's face at a concert, at a nightclub, even at a beach resort. Sometimes Tristan was present, often he was not. My instincts told me more was going on than casual friendship. I needed something concrete, so I kept watching. My chance came 2 months before the wedding, when Serena and Derek booked a weekend getaway to a nearby lake cabin. Tristan was overseas, meaning their rendezvous would likely go unnoticed by everyone, except me. I took a personal day from work, borrowed a friend's car, and drove out early on Saturday morning. The cabin sat secluded among tall pines, the gravel road deserted. From a discreet distance, I watched them arrive, arms draped around each other as they giggled and disappeared inside. I snapped photographs, timestamped them, and recorded short videos. My heart pounded, palpable adrenaline mixing with grim satisfaction. Waiting in that car felt like an eternity. I stayed until Sunday afternoon, fighting off fatigue with coffee and sheer determination. When they emerged, I captured every tender gesture, every stolen kiss. I wanted evidence so damning that no excuses could stand. Part of me felt sick watching it unfold, remembering how easily Serena had cast me out. Yet another part felt vindicated. She was no saint, and I finally had the proof. Once they drove away, I carefully backed out and returned home, my phone brimming with incriminating material. Revenge had taken root, and it demanded to be unleashed. I bided my time, refining my plan. It wasn't enough to ruin Serena's relationship privately. She had publicly humiliated me, so her downfall had to be equally public. The wedding day loomed, and I acquired a single invitation through a mutual acquaintance who pitied our family drama. I prepared a neat folder with prints of the photographs, along with a USB drive containing videos. I even included date and timestamps on a separate document, ensuring everything was labeled and verifiable. My final touch was a small letter addressed to Tristan. I wanted him to know exactly who betrayed him. The wedding venue was a lush country club decorated in pastel flowers and gold accents. Guests meandered across manicured lawns, sipping champagne beneath a bright spring sky. I arrived wearing a modest suit, blending into the crowd, greeting distant relatives with polite nods. My parents stood near the entrance, each looking older and more fatigued. Mom's hair had grayed, and Dad's once proud posture seemed stooped. They spotted me, eyes widening in surprise, but neither approached. I felt a pang of sadness, but I quickly buried it. I was here for a purpose, to expose Serena for the liar she was. The ceremony began under an arch of roses, the officiant's voice resonating through hidden speakers. Serena appeared radiant in her white gown, her face a mask of bridal joy. Tristan, looking dapper in his tailored suit, beamed with naive excitement. I waited in the back row, the folder heavy on my lap. My heart hammered as vows were exchanged. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, a hush fell. My breath caught. I stood up, feeling every eye upon me. For a heartbeat, I almost faltered, but then I remembered the day Serena called me a thief. I cleared my throat, voice trembling as I announced I had reasons to believe the bride was unfaithful. Gasps erupted, Serena's face blanched, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. Tristan's eyes darted from me to her, confusion etched on his features. The officiant tried to regain order, but the wave of murmurs swelled. I approached with measured steps, folder in hand. My arms shook, yet I pressed onward, turning to Tristan. "I'm sorry," I said, "but you deserve to know before making a lifelong commitment." I extended the folder toward him, the weight of truth heavy between us. For a moment, Tristan didn't move. Then he took the folder, flipping through the photographs. A hush fell over the crowd, each person craning to see his reaction. My parents stood rooted in place, mouths agape. Serena tried to snatch the folder, but Tristan pulled away. I could see the anger and betrayal ignite in his eyes as he saw the timestamps, the pictures of Serena entwined with another man. Someone in the audience muttered curses under their breath. The officiant stepped back, sensing a scandal about to explode. I braced myself for chaos, certain there was no turning back. Serena tried to deny everything, calling me a liar and a vengeful brother out to destroy her happiness. Her voice was shrill, desperation staining every syllable. Tristan continued flipping through photos with trembling hands. Then, with an abrupt motion, he tossed the folder on the ground. Photographs scattered like fallen leaves, images of Serena and Derek in damning embraces. The crowd collectively gasped. I watched Serena's composure crumble as she realized no one was buying her denials. She lunged at me, tears streaming, shouting that I had stolen from her, from all of them, but I stood my ground, unmoved. Tristan demanded to know who Derek was. Others chimed in, fueling the confusion. I said nothing, letting Serena flounder as she stammered incoherent explanations. My parents finally stepped forward, Dad's face ashen, Mom shaking her head in disbelief. She tried to placate Tristan, insisting there had to be a misunderstanding, but the evidence was undeniable. The officiant closed the ceremony book, signaling the union would not be performed. I felt a grim sense of fulfillment, but also a pang of regret that it had come to this. Still, Serena had orchestrated my downfall years ago. She deserved no mercy now. I walked away from the ceremony, ignoring the stunned stares, leaving chaos in my wake. Outside, the bright sunlight momentarily blinded me. I heard footsteps behind me, Tristan's. He grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. "Thank you," he managed, his voice tight with shock. I'm sorry about whatever happened in the past." He offered a trembling handshake. I nodded, my throat constricted by unexpected emotion. For so long, I had dreamed of this moment, but it felt hollow. My sister's betrayal was laid bare, and Tristan's life was upended. Yet, there was no triumphant fanfare, only the lingering taste of justice. I slipped the letter I had written into his hand. He gave me a questioning glance, then tucked it into his pocket. The letter recounted my own story, from the accusation of theft to my exile and eventual climb back to self-respect. I knew he would read it later, perhaps when the shock wore off. Then I left him standing there, completely dazed but grateful, while guests spilled out of the venue in confusion. I could almost taste Serena's fury in the air. 5 years of pent-up hurt had burst forth in a single strike. At last, I felt vindicated. I expected to feel relief, but the days after the wedding were tumultuous. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed me for planning an elaborate scene, others pitied Tristan, and still others wondered if Serena might spin a different narrative. My phone buzzed with messages from unknown numbers, some threatening, some sympathetic. I changed my number twice. Work offered a welcome distraction, but I found my thoughts drifting, replaying that moment when I exposed Serena. I tried to savor my victory, but something lingered. A hollowness, perhaps a realization that no revenge could truly erase or heal the scars she left behind. 1 week later, I received a letter in the mail from my parents. It was brief, scrawled in my father's bold handwriting. He wrote that they had confronted Serena about her accusations against me. She broke down, admitted she lied out of spite because she felt I was always the favored child. She wanted to see me disgraced, so she planted the stolen money. Dad's words wavered between anger and regret. He didn't explicitly apologize, but he hinted that their trust in Serena was shaken and that they realized too late how deeply they had wounded me. It felt surreal. Days later, my mother called. Her voice trembled with emotion, asking if I could ever come home. For a long moment, I said nothing, the silence thick between us. I pictured our living room where Serena had first denounced me, remembered the sting of betrayal in their eyes. Finally, I replied that I had built a life of my own, one that no longer depended on their acceptance. I didn't lash out or hurl accusations. I simply told her the truth. I wasn't sure I could ever forgive what they let happen. I think she quietly wept before hanging up. Serena never contacted me directly, though I heard whispers of her spiraling into depression. Derek vanished from her life soon after, presumably once her financial stability collapsed. She moved back in with our parents, or so I was told. Part of me took satisfaction in that turn of events, remembering how she had conspired to get me thrown out. Another part of me felt oddly hollow. I had dreamt of revenge for years, but when it arrived, it didn't heal the old wounds. The memory of her accusation remained, a stain on my childhood that no public spectacle could erase. In the following months, I focused on myself. I poured my energy into work, rose through the ranks, and even started my own side project developing a mobile app. I made new friends, traveled to cities I had only dreamed about, and learned to find joy in small everyday things. My past still haunted me sometimes, especially at night when I'd recall the heartbreak of being cast out. But I learned that my sister's betrayal no longer defined me. It was simply a chapter in my life, one that shaped me but did not dictate my future or my worth. A year passed. I heard snippets of Serena's life. She lived quietly with our parents, rarely venturing out. She found part-time work at a local shop, but I suspected she lacked the drive to rebuild her old lifestyle. My parents visited me once, standing awkwardly at my apartment door, bearing homemade food as a peace offering. We spoke for an hour in halting conversation, dancing around the pain. They mentioned Serena rarely, and I realized they were ashamed of both her actions and their own. I accepted their food, their tentative gestures, but I maintained a guarded distance. Forgiveness felt impossible. Sometimes I wondered if I had become too hardened, but then I recalled the helplessness I felt, a teenager wrongfully cast out, and the rage that simmered beneath every breath. It wasn't simply about stealing money or telling a lie. It was the destruction of trust and the emotional scars that followed. Though I had exposed Serena and found some measure of closure, the real damage lingered in my relationships and sense of self. I refused to hate myself for refusing to forgive. Forgiveness was truly a gift, and I couldn't extend it to those who let me suffer alone. Standing on my balcony now, overlooking a city illuminated by 1,000 lights, I reflect on how far I've come. I hold no regret for exposing Serena, nor do I lament the fracture within my family. Some might call me callous, but they never lived through that betrayal. I chose my path. Self-respect over forced reconciliation, truth over convenient lies. In the end, I salvaged my dignity from the wreckage Serena caused. I've learned that triumph is never pure. It often carries lingering shadows. But I remain unbroken, and that, more than anything, is the victory I cherish the most. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still smell the faint traces of my childhood home, old leather, oven-warmed bread, and the subtle whiff of simmering resentment. In those cramped rooms, I witnessed the difference between how my parents treated me and how they lavished attention on my sister Anna as though I were an unimportant afterthought. Whenever Anna needed something, piano lessons, a new dress, or even a ride across town at midnight, my parents sprang into action, pouring every resource and devotion into her comfort and success. As for me, I grew used to finding my own way, patching the holes in my clothes and learning to cook simple meals while I was still just a child. That relentless disparity gnawed at me, though I tried to bury it under layers of self-sufficiency, convincing myself that independence made me stronger and less vulnerable to their ongoing neglect. Over the years, I watched Anna blossom into a charming woman who believed the world owed her every comfort, while I learned how to make do with whatever scraps remained. Despite the constant comparisons and occasional contempt, I clung to hope that someday my parents would see me, truly see me, and acknowledge that I, too, was deeply worth loving. That day never arrived, and by the time I moved out at 18, I promised myself I would never beg for their approval or chase after their displays of affection. It was both liberating and terrifying to leave everything familiar behind, but the knowledge that nobody would overshadow me in my own space gave me an exhilarating sense of peace. For years, I worked menial jobs to put myself through college, using the leftover hours to study late into the night, driven by a need to prove my own worth. In phone conversations, my mother would rush to share Anna's latest triumph, a prestigious internship, a new condo in the city, while barely asking how I was managing my rent or groceries. My father sometimes chimed in with half-hearted inquiries about my life, but it was clear that what really excited him was describing Anna's string of boyfriends or her dinner parties. I discovered, through social media, that Anna flaunted her charmed existence at every turn, filtering her photos to perfection, writing captions, and soaking up likes like a queen holding court. Meanwhile, I toiled in a cubicle at a small financial firm, paying off student loans and learning the delicate art of blending into the background so nobody would question me. It felt unfair, but that was the pattern of my life, so I pushed resentment aside and pretended it didn't matter, while inside, I fanned the embers of quiet bitterness. The years passed, and I found a small circle of friends who knew my quirks and my struggles, offering a kind of emotional refuge that I never received at home. Through their support and my own determination, I climbed slowly up the corporate ladder, negotiating for raises and promotions, all without ever expecting a word of praise from my parents. Nobody said it aloud, but I knew I was more resilient than Anna, that each setback had toughened me, forging armor that allowed me to withstand life's smaller, daily disappointments. I lost track of how many times I wondered whether my parents might ever regret neglecting me, if a day would come when their devotion to Anna would spark consequences. I never wished harm on anyone, but the idea that their favoritism might come back to haunt them sometimes lulled me to sleep with a smile tugging at my lips. Eventually, the day arrived when my parents discovered that Anna's charmed existence was more fragile than they had imagined, and they found themselves drowning in the aftermath of her abandonment. It started with a phone call late one evening, my mother's voice trembling as she explained that Anna had refused to lend them money to pay off a medical bill. Apparently, Anna claimed that her finances were tight and she couldn't spare a dime, though a quick glance at her social media showed her enjoying vacations and designer shopping sprees. I listened in stunned silence as my mother's voice broke, begging me to help because the hospital demanded payment, and my father's insurance had lapsed due to an administrative mishap. In that moment, a complex mix of pity, anger, and vindication surged through me, each emotion battling to define my response, but I forced my voice to remain unnaturally calm. I told my mother I'd think about it and call back, then hung up, my heart pounding as old wounds ripped open, releasing feelings I'd spent years trying to bury. For hours, I paced my small apartment, replaying memories of holiday dinners where Anna sat at the head of the table while I served plates or washed dishes without complaint. I recalled birthdays spent alone, unwrapping practical gifts I'd purchased for myself, while Anna showcased the jewelry my parents claimed they couldn't afford to buy me, even if they wanted. The more I thought about their request, the more I understood that this was my chance to reclaim a fragment of dignity, to show them exactly how it truly felt. Still, I wrestled with guilt, wondering if stooping to their level would make me just as callous, yet I couldn't ignore the satisfaction sparking in the corners of my mind. By morning, I called them back and agreed to meet, requesting they come to my apartment rather than some neutral cafe because I wanted them to see my entire reality. When they arrived, I noticed my father's limp and the shadows under my mother's eyes, signs of their vulnerability that both angered and softened me, sparking a complex emotional conflict. My mother tearfully recounted the mounting bills, how Anna had turned them away without a single comforting word, and how they'd realized they had truly nobody else to rely on. My father, quieter than I remembered, stared at his hands, which had once built my sister's science fair projects, while refusing to help me craft even the simplest cardboard model. Images flooded my mind, him crouched next to Anna, painting solar system planets with her, while I sat across the room with tears in my eyes, completely invisible to them. They apologized in halting sentences, as though unsure how to form words of remorse for a lifetime of casual dismissal, and I let them speak without offering any meaningful reassurance. When the moment felt right, I cleared my throat and told them I could help, but my support would come with conditions, terms that would be binding and strictly enforced. They looked startled, perhaps expecting unconditional charity, yet desperation made them nod, so I outlined the arrangement. I would cover the medical bills, but they must sign a formal contract. In that document, they would acknowledge the sum borrowed, agree to repay with interest, and relinquish any further claims to my assistance if they failed to meet the strict deadlines. My father opened his mouth to protest, but the sight of my gaze silenced him, and my mother shakily agreed, signing away the last shred of parental authority they possessed. In the weeks that followed, I set up a payment plan with the hospital, used my savings to clear the debts, and forwarded every receipt to my parents for transparency. They thanked me profusely at first, but their gratitude was laced with discomfort, as though each polite phrase tasted bitter, a reminder that their golden daughter had completely deserted them. I learned that Anna had fled to Europe with a new boyfriend, ghosting our parents when they mentioned her share of responsibility, ignoring messages, and changing phone numbers without explanation. Part of me felt an odd admiration for her nerve, but mostly, I reveled in the irony. The child they had cherished was now the one inflicting the deepest betrayal. Still, her actions didn't erase the scars she'd helped inflict. and I saw my parents' predicament as cosmic payback, their illusions of favoritism unraveling in the harsh light of reality. As the medical bills stabilized, I launched the repayment schedule, emailing them a formal invoice each month, complete with interest calculations that reminded them kindness now had a price tag. At first, they tried to meet these demands promptly, perhaps hoping to restore some semblance of normalcy, but their funds dwindled, and soon they fell behind, missing deadline after deadline. My mother left tearful voicemails, promising partial payments once her disability checks arrived, while my father's pride led him to avoid speaking at all, a silent admission of stark failure. A twisted part of me enjoyed watching them scramble, reminded of every time I'd scraped by alone, longing for even a hint of support they had so freely given Anna. Yet guilt seeped through my bravado, catching me off guard when I heard my mother sob or saw my father's name appear on my phone, his voice trembling with hopelessness. One rainy evening, they showed up unannounced, rain-soaked and shaking, pleading for more time, explaining how difficult it was to keep pace with the relentless schedule I'd so carefully constructed. I invited them in, brewed tea, and sat across the table, remembering the countless nights I'd waited for a small gesture of comfort that never arrived, feeling a strange reversal. With measured calm, I reminded them that the terms were unambiguous, just as their favoritism had been, and that empathy was not something one could demand after years of neglect. They stared at me with heartbreak etched into their expressions, and for a fleeting instant, I imagined my younger self finally receiving an apology sincere enough to mend old scars. But even then, the apology was tainted by their desperation, not a genuine acknowledgement of past wrongs, and I realized I no longer cared whether they felt remorse or not. They left, heads bowed, murmuring thanks, promising to do better, leaving behind a trail of damp footprints and a residue of sorrow that clung to the walls of my apartment. In the ensuing weeks, I heard rumors that my parents had sold heirlooms, downsized their lifestyle, and even considered renting out a portion of their house to cover the repayments. Part of me was amazed they would go to such lengths for my money, but another part remembered I was the child who got leftover love, if any at all. Eventually, they missed enough payments that the contract stipulated immediate settlement, or I could seize their assets if they defaulted completely, an option that both terrified and secretly thrilled me. At the final deadline, they arrived on my doorstep one last time, cheeks hollow, eyes desperate, offering their rundown car as collateral, surrendering the very symbol of their former mobility. I watched them from the living room window, recalling how they'd never given me a ride unless Anna was already in the passenger seat. And now they stood powerless, begging. That final transaction felt like a line I couldn't uncross. Accepting their car meant slicing away their last shred of independence, completely confining them to the mercy of public transportation. A memory flickered of me walking miles from school because Anna needed the car, my parents insisting I was old enough to manage without their help, while she was not. I accepted the keys, ignoring the tremor in my mother's hands, and scrawled my signature on the paperwork, each pen stroke carving a deeper gulf between us. Irreversible, cold, final. They thanked me again, voices faint, and trudged away, leaving me holding a set of worn car keys and a swirl of emotions that threatened to consume me from inside. For days, I couldn't sleep, utterly haunted by flashes of my father's defeated stance, my mother's tear-streaked cheeks, and that unwavering sense of justice that told me they deserved it. One evening, I found myself driving their old sedan aimlessly around the city, the engine sputtering at stoplights, the worn upholstery smelling like faint, cheap air freshener and distant regret. I remembered being a child in that back seat, overshadowed by Anna's chatter, my parents laughing with her while I stared out the window, wishing they'd turn around and see me. Now I held the power, and it filled me with a sorrowful triumph, like a lonely victory parade where I marched alone, flanked by painful, ghostly banners of lingering heartbreak. As the city lights blurred by, I wondered if I had become something worse than them, using their weakness against them, or if I was simply balancing the cosmic scales. A few days later, they called to say they were relocating to a cheaper apartment, and I felt a deep pang in my chest, a mixture of guilt and vindication. I wondered if they'd try to contact Anna, beg for her assistance, but apparently she was unreachable, a phantom who had severed ties with the very people who worshipped her. In quiet moments, I reflected on how my parents' downfall was orchestrated by their own hands, shaped by years of preferential treatment that warped Anna's sense of responsibility and empathy. Rather than building unity, they'd sown a dynamic of entitlement, and now the favored child had utterly abandoned them, forcing them to rely on the son they'd always considered second-rate. Friends told me I should forgive, that carrying anger would poison my soul, but I saw forgiveness as a door leading straight back into the deeply ingrained patterns of neglect. I refused to revert to that powerless child who begged for scraps of love, so I held fast to my boundaries, letting them experience the consequences of their own design. And though a quiet sadness settled in my chest at times, I stood taller, feeling more self-respect than ever, knowing I wasn't obligated to mend what they had irreparably broken. My parents' calls became less frequent, and when they did reach out, it was businesslike, focusing on payments and schedules, as though the emotional chasm between us was too vast. I never asked how they were managing, never offered time, just as they had never checked if I had enough to eat or a safe place to sleep each night. In a twist, I learned that Anna had married her boyfriend overseas, oblivious to the wreckage she'd left behind, and my parents stood alone, indebted to the child they'd undervalued. Time slipped by, turning weeks into months, and eventually the entire debt was repaid, though the real cost remained unspoken, carved into our fractured bonds beyond any possible easy repair. After that final payment, my parents stopped calling altogether, and I didn't reach out either, content to let the silence stand as a testament to lines now permanently firmly drawn. Sometimes I drove their old car through familiar streets, past the house where I'd grown up, remembering how the walls seemed to echo Anna's laughter while mine was barely heard. It still felt surreal to realize I owned the vehicle that once ferried Anna to fancy classes and competitions, a physical trophy of a twisted triumph over years of neglect. Eventually, I found a new job in another state, packed my few belongings, and prepared to leave those painful memories behind, hoping to craft a future without their lingering shadows. Before I left, I drove to my parents' tiny apartment, parked outside for a moment, and debated whether to knock on the door to see if they wanted a goodbye. I never moved from the driver's seat, my knuckles whitening on the steering wheel, torn between pity and the knowledge that any gesture might unravel what little peace I'd gained. In the end, I turned the key, letting the engine rattle to life, and drove away without a backward glance, leaving them to their regrets, just as they'd left me. The new city offered fresh opportunities, and though I carried the scars of my past, I channeled them into a determination to prove I was worth every success and happiness. I found an apartment filled with sunlight, decorated its walls with art I'd chosen, savoring each small freedom that reminded me nobody could overshadow me here. Not anymore. Not ever. Sometimes I thought about Anna, flitting around Europe, oblivious to the chaos she'd left in her wake, convinced she was entitled to luxury while her family unraveled in her absence. I doubted she'd ever realize or care about the fallout of her actions, content in her curated world of social media applause, floating through life untouched by consequence or guilt. And maybe that was her punishment, the hollowness of a life without genuine connections, while I, scarred but healing, had forged a path on my own terms and clear conscience. Over time, people asked about my family, and I'd offer a polite half-truth, saying we weren't close, never delving into the labyrinth of favoritism that had deeply shaped my childhood. I saw no point in trying to justify old wounds or unravel the complexities to strangers, so I let them assume whatever they wanted, keeping my victories and defeats hidden. Every now and then, my phone would display my mother's number, but I ignored the calls, not out of spite, but a certainty that reopening wounds would serve no purpose. Once, near Christmas, I found a voicemail of her sobbing, apologizing for everything, but the words felt hollow, a desperate attempt at absolution I was not ever obliged to give. I deleted it, feeling a pang that quickly morphed into steely resolve, reminding myself that giving in would erase the hard-won respect and resilience I'd cultivated through standing my ground. Eventually, those calls stopped too, and an expansive calm settled over my life, though traces of sorrow remained, the final echo of a family that had failed to be one. Even now, I stand by my choice, for betrayals run deep for absolution, and the sweetest revenge is living a life that needs no validation from those who overlooked you. I still remember the day I realized my stepfather had pinned a crime on me that I never committed, I had just turned 17 at the time, living in the outskirts of Chicago with my mother and him, my so-called guardian. My father had died when I was 10, and for a long time, it was just me and my mom trying to make ends meet. Then came this tall, broad-shouldered stranger with a bit of charm and a lot of promises. He was good at talking his way into her heart, and soon enough, he moved in. Back then, I believed in second chances and in the possibility that a man could love someone else's child as his own. But as the months wore on, I saw the cracks beneath his smooth exterior. There were late nights where I could smell alcohol seeping through the walls of my tiny bedroom, and mornings where he'd greet me with a glance that spoke volumes of how little he actually thought of me. I tried to ignore the tension, for my mother's sake. She looked so happy whenever he showered her with attention, and I didn't want to be the reason that rare smile faltered. So I kept my mouth shut, even when he said things that made me feel worthless, even when I heard hushed arguments about money in the kitchen. I wanted to believe in the illusion that my mom had finally found someone who cared for both of us. But illusions have a way of shattering. One evening, I woke up to hushed voices arguing just outside my bedroom door. My mother's frantic whisper carried through the thin walls, and I caught snippets of words like mortgage and emergency fund. My heart pounded because I knew she had a bit of money set aside for a rainy day, a small sum she had painstakingly saved from her nursing shifts at the local hospital. I didn't know the full extent of her finances, but I was aware that it was all she had for our immediate security. I tried to fall back asleep, telling myself that everything would be fine by morning, but my restless mind wouldn't let me. When the sun finally rose, my stepfather was already gone. My mother sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee, as though it might hold the answers to her silent pleas. She looked up when she noticed me, the worry lines etched into her face deepening. She didn't say much, only that she needed to speak with him again before we decided on any course of action. I offered to help in any way I could, but she insisted everything was under control. Even then, I sensed a storm brewing, one that would soon tear apart our fragile life. Yet, I never imagined just how vicious that storm would become, nor that it would leave me standing alone with the wreckage. No, I had no idea that my stepfather's darkness was about to swallow me whole. About a week later, my stepfather returned in the dead of night. I was awakened by the sound of the front door slamming, and I heard him stumbling in the hallway. He reeked of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. My mother rushed to him, begging to know where he had been and what had happened to the money they'd been discussing. I stayed in the shadows, watching him sway as he tried to piece together a believable lie. First, he mumbled something about an investment that had gone wrong. Then, with more urgency, he wove a story about how he was robbed at gunpoint outside a bar. I could see in my mother's eyes that she wanted to believe him, but the logic didn't line up. If he was robbed, why didn't he file a police report? Where had he really been? Eventually, his frustration boiled over and he turned his anger onto me. He pointed an accusing finger in my direction, slurring his words as he shouted that he knew I'd stolen the money, that I must have snuck into the bedroom safe. The accusation felt like a punch to the gut. I was 17, with no means to even access the safe, let alone knowledge of its combination. And yet, he insisted I was the culprit. My mother looked torn, caught between her love for me and her desire to trust the man she'd let into our home. I will never forget the moment when she asked me, with tears in her eyes, if I had taken the money. I denied it with every ounce of sincerity I had. I expected my mother to defend me, to see through the lies. She knew me better than anyone, or so I believed. But my stepfather's hold on her was stronger than I realized. He had planted seeds of doubt, feeding on every little mistake or teenage rebellion I'd had. Suddenly, I was the rebellious kid who talked back in class once, or stayed out late with friends without permission. Those trivial missteps became evidence of my deceitful nature. Each time I insisted on my innocence, he twisted my words, making it appear as though I was only trying to cover my tracks. Eventually, I saw the uncertainty in my mother's eyes solidify into suspicion. I was crushed. The day after that confrontation, I found my clothes packed into 2 suitcases left by the door. My mother stood by silently as my stepfather instructed me to get out, telling me I was no longer welcome under their roof. He spat at my feet, calling me a thief, a lowlife who'd stolen from my own family. I pleaded with my mother, reminded her of our bond, of all the times we stood by each other when Dad died. But she just stared at the floor, her shoulders trembling in silent guilt or fear. That was the moment I realized I had lost her to him. I grabbed my bags and left, vowing that one day I would have my reckoning. I spent my first night away from home on a park bench. It was a warm summer evening, at least, but the humiliation seared deeper than any cold could have. I had a few $100s saved from my part-time job at a grocery store, but it wouldn't last long. My immediate concern was survival, and the only place I could think to go was an old friend's garage. Her parents were reluctant to let me stay at first, but they agreed to let me crash there for a couple of nights after hearing my story. I never mentioned the details of the theft accusation. I just said there was trouble at home, which wasn't far from the truth. Over the next few weeks, I learned the harsh reality of being on my own. I applied to every restaurant, retail shop, and gas station I could find. I cut back on meals, sometimes going to bed with an empty stomach just to stretch my limited funds. Pride wasn't a luxury I could afford anymore, so I took whatever odd jobs came my way. Whether it was mowing lawns or washing dishes at a dive bar, I did it. All the while, bitterness grew inside me like a festering wound. The memories of my stepfather's accusations, the pain on my mother's face as she watched me leave, haunted my every waking moment. I was determined to prove myself, to succeed, if only to show them they had made a grave mistake. After turning 18, I managed to secure a spot in a community college. Tuition was a concern, but financial aid and scholarships became my lifeline. I studied business administration, not out of any deep passion, but because I saw it as a tool. I wanted the skills to climb society's ladder, to gain influence and power, anything that would help me eventually stand toe-to-toe with my stepfather. The nights were long. I worked at a nearby convenience store until midnight, then stayed up late finishing assignments. My social life was non-existent, but I didn't care. The only relationships I fostered were alliances with professors who could vouch for my determination and classmates who I could team up with for study groups. I spent weekends volunteering at local nonprofits, partly to pad my resume, and partly to remind myself that despite everything, I still had some kindness left in me. Yet, beneath that veneer of diligence, an unquenchable thirst for vengeance simmered. I'd find myself daydreaming about confronting my stepfather, shoving cold, hard evidence of my success in his face. I imagined my mother standing beside him, finally recognizing her mistake and begging for my forgiveness. Those fantasies fueled me, but they also kept me up at night, filling me with a restless energy. I was on a mission, and nothing would deter me. Some people might call it toxic or obsessive, but I saw it as my only solace. I was forging a new path, and every step I took was aimed at returning to the place I was exiled from, stronger and less merciful than before. 4 years passed in a blur of lectures, late-night shifts, and relentless ambition. I graduated with honors, clutching my diploma as though it were a ticket to a life I'd been denied. After that, I managed to land an entry-level job at a small financial consulting firm. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was enough for me to finally rent a modest apartment and start building a semblance of stability. I poured myself into my work, determined to climb the corporate ladder faster than anyone else. I studied the markets, read every business journal I could find, and volunteered for the most challenging projects. My boss took notice, and within 2 years, I was promoted. My colleagues whispered about my single-mindedness, the way I never joined them for happy hour or team dinners. There were rumors that I had no personal life, no family to speak of. Let them think what they wanted. My personal life was overshadowed by a single purpose. I saved every spare dollar, investing carefully, quietly growing my portfolio. Sometimes I'd sit in my apartment at night, staring at my reflection in the window, and wonder if my mother ever regretted what she had allowed to happen. I heard from distant relatives that she and my stepfather were still together, living in the old house, barely scraping by. Rumor had it he gambled heavily, losing more than he won, but always managing to spin a yarn that it would pay off soon. With each rumor, my resolve to destroy him grew stronger. A turning point came when I met an older businessman named Victor at a conference in New York. He was everything I aspired to be, successful, respected, and intimidating in the boardroom. We struck up a conversation after I asked a particularly pointed question during his panel discussion. Perhaps he saw a bit of himself in my hunger, or maybe he just liked the attention I gave him. Either way, he offered me a job at his private equity firm, a position that promised more challenges, and far greater rewards. I jumped at the chance. Working under Victor was like being thrown into the deep end of a shark tank. He expected results, and he had no patience for excuses. I thrived under the pressure, devouring knowledge on mergers, acquisitions, and leveraging assets. I also learned about strategic takedowns, how to dismantle a competitor by targeting their weaknesses and exploiting their debts. Victor taught me that sometimes business isn't just about profit. It's about power and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've bested your rival. As the months rolled by, I began to see a path. My stepfather's gambling addiction was a glaring vulnerability, a crack in his defenses. If he owed money to the wrong people, if he was desperate enough, I could maneuver him into a financial trap. With Victor's guidance, I learned the art of the deal, and more importantly, the art of retribution. I studied my stepfather's patterns from a distance, gathering information from mutual acquaintances and public records. Soon, an opportunity presented itself, and I knew it was time to strike. I learned through a contact that my stepfather had been borrowing money from various loan sharks. He was on the hook for a significant sum, and his attempts at winning big in the casino were only sinking him further. I approached one of these creditors through a shell company I set up, offering to buy my stepfather's debt at a slight premium. The deal was simple enough for the creditor. He'd recover most of his money without having to chase my stepfather down. And for me, it meant I now owned my stepfather's obligation. Legally, he owed me, though he had no idea. The next step was to tighten the noose. I orchestrated a situation where he would be lured into a new gambling opportunity, an underground casino that one of Victor's associates controlled. With the false promise of a hot tip, my stepfather was enticed to go all in on a rigged, high-stakes poker game, double or nothing. Predictably, he lost everything. In that moment, he was hopelessly trapped, owing more money than he could ever repay. That's when I revealed myself. I showed up at his doorstep, a polite smile on my face, a thick folder of legal documents in hand. He looked older, weaker than I remembered, with a stained undershirt and trembling hands. I introduced myself as the representative of the company that now owned his debts. When he realized who I was, his face went pale. It was as if he'd seen a ghost returning for vengeance. I made him an offer. He could sign over the title to the house, along with any other assets he possessed, and I would consider his debt partially settled. He'd still owe a large sum, of course, but the immediate threat of legal action would be postponed. I watched him wrestle with the decision, fear warring with pride in his eyes. The man who once called me a thief now stood on the brink of losing everything, forced to beg for mercy. My mother appeared in the doorway, her gaze darting between us. She looked frail, as though life had ground her down since I left. She didn't recognize me at first. Maybe she never truly saw me, even when I was a child. But when she realized who I was, she let out a choked sob. I told her I wasn't here for reconciliation or pity. I was here on business, pure and simple. My stepfather tried to protest, to come up with some scheme to buy time. He claimed he'd find a way to repay the debt if I just gave him a chance. I laughed bitterly. The same man who had robbed my mother, who had lied and turned her against me, was now pleading for compassion. Did he truly believe I had any left for him? I laid out the documents on the dusty coffee table and insisted he sign. Watching the pen tremble in his hand as he scribbled his name felt like poetic justice. In the weeks that followed, I seized every asset he had. The house was sold at auction, with the proceeds funneled into my company. The vehicles he owned were repossessed. Any semblance of financial security he once had vanished, leaving him to fend for himself on the streets, just as I had to do years ago. My mother tried to call me, leaving tearful voicemails asking me to spare him. She claimed he'd changed, that he was remorseful. Each time, I deleted the messages without listening to the end. It wasn't that I found joy in her suffering. It was simply that I had no pity left for a man who had shown me none. Word spread through the neighborhood about what had happened, and some people branded me as heartless. But they hadn't lived through the betrayal, the humiliation, the nights on a park bench. I'd crafted this fate for him, yes, but I saw it as retribution, not cruelty. Meanwhile, in the business world, my star continued to rise. With the capital gain from the sale of his property, I reinvested, striking deals that multiplied my earnings. Victor was impressed by my tenacity. though he never pried into how I came into possession of those particular assets. In his world, results mattered more than explanations. I relished the success, yet I felt an odd emptiness gnawing at me. I dedicated so much of my life to this revenge, and now that it was done, I found myself asking what came next. I began to wonder if I'd become as heartless as the man I despised. Late at night, in the quiet of my penthouse, doubts surfaced about what my revenge had cost me. Then, I received a letter from my mother saying my stepfather had died in an alley behind the old casino. She asked me to attend his funeral. Though I felt no pity, something compelled me to go. I arrived at a small cemetery where my mother stood alone by a cheap coffin. She looked up, tears freezing on her cheeks. We didn't speak. I stayed until the coffin was lowered, then turned to leave. She grabbed my arm, whispered an apology, but I said nothing. There was no forgiveness left in me, only the hollow realization that I had become a stranger to her. In that moment, I understood the final price of my vengeance. Though I had claimed justice, I had lost the last remnants of the love I once cherished. As I walked away, I felt an echo of my younger self, still longing for a mother's embrace. Yet I knew that door had closed forever, leaving emptiness in its wake. I still can't believe how quickly everything fell apart. One day, Linda and I were in a comfortable routine, weekend brunches at our favorite cafe, movies on the couch, that sense of stability I'd always valued. We'd known each other since college, and though our marriage was hardly exciting, I thought it was built on a solid foundation. I figured we'd both found what we needed: companionship, respect, a future we could trust. Then, in a matter of weeks, she decided to leave me. What made it worse was her reason. An astrologer told her we weren't ever meant to be. I felt pathetic trying to reason with her, as though logic had any place in this madness. Linda started quoting star charts, planetary alignments, and cosmic flows. She showed me scribbled notes from the astrologer, a well-known guru named Ramesh. According to him, she was trapped in a karmic cycle with me, and the only way to break free was to embrace her true destiny. Within days, she moved her clothes out, found a short-term sublet, and stopped returning my calls. Then I learned the worst part. She hadn't left me for just anyone. She left me for my brother, David. David always had a competitive streak. Growing up, he had to outdo me in everything: sports, academics, even simple board games. While I worked diligently toward steady goals, he was flamboyant and charismatic, always seeking attention. People gravitated toward him, including my parents, who seemed to admire his daring spirit. I used to rationalize that he was just wired differently, but as the years passed, his drive to overshadow me became impossible to ignore. It didn't cross my mind he'd sabotage my marriage, though. That's exactly what he did, using astrology as a ruse to worm his way into Linda's life. I found out about the bribe almost by accident. A friend told me he saw David meeting Ramesh at a fancy lounge downtown. At first, I dismissed it. Then, curiosity got the better of me, so I talked to that friend again, pressed for more details. He described how David discreetly handed over an envelope, while Ramesh nodded as though confirming instructions. I tried to pretend this was all some misunderstanding, yet a gnawing suspicion wouldn't let go. Eventually, I decided to confront Ramesh myself. I paid for a private reading, walked into his incense-filled studio, and demanded the truth. Ramesh tried to maintain his mystical facade, lighting candles and chanting a few lines about cosmic synergy. I cut him off, explaining that I knew about David's envelope. He went pale for a moment, then forced a smile, insisting it was merely a charitable donation. I pressed harder, mentioning that I had eyewitnesses. He finally caved, confessing David had paid him to fabricate the reading that convinced Linda she was destined to be with my brother. Ramesh apologized profusely, but I didn't care. His role in destroying my marriage was inexcusable. I walked out, furious and hell-bent on exposing everything. But Linda and David had already moved in together, temporarily. It was surreal. My own brother was setting up house with my wife, and nobody in the family wanted to believe it was anything but destiny. Mom and Dad were torn, asking me to keep an open mind, claiming it was Linda's choice. They refused to believe David would stoop to bribery. I could see their hesitation. They loved the idea of two family members uniting, but also felt uneasy about the circumstances. Meanwhile, Linda was completely unreachable. She blocked my number, ignoring every message I sent into the void. My anger festered like a wound. I spent nights pacing my empty living room, replaying events, wondering how I could have missed the signs. Linda's sudden fascination with horoscopes now felt like a red flag I had chosen to ignore. Part of me wondered if I'd been too complacent as a husband, too trusting of David. Yet, the deeper truth was that Linda let herself believe a lie, and David fed it to her for his own gain. I craved revenge, but I wanted to be smart about it. Impulsive actions might backfire. I needed a plan, and patience to execute it. My first move was to gather evidence. I recorded my conversation with Ramesh, covertly of course, and made sure I had copies of those scribbled notes. I even convinced him to sign a statement verifying David's bribe. He didn't want more trouble, and I used that fear to my advantage. Next, I reached out to a lawyer friend, Danielle, to ask about my options. She told me it was possible to sue for alienation of affection in some jurisdictions, though it was rarely a slam dunk. Still, having proof gave me leverage. Now I just needed Linda and David to learn it. I waited for the perfect moment. Word reached me that David and Linda planned to host a small housewarming party. It felt absurdly quick, just weeks after leaving me, but apparently astrology had given them the green light to celebrate. I made sure to attend, despite the tension. When I showed up, everyone fell silent. Linda looked stunned, David annoyed. I calmly offered congratulations, even brought a bottle of wine. My real intention wasn't to cause a scene, but to plant doubt. Halfway through the evening, I pulled Linda aside and told her I had something that would change her entire perspective. She bristled, crossing her arms as though to shield herself. I didn't lash out. Instead, I said, "It's about Ramesh." The flicker in her eyes showed me I had her attention. I invited her to my apartment the next afternoon, promising to reveal what I'd discovered. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. David noticed us talking and stormed over, demanding to know what was going on. I smiled and said, "Congratulations again," before walking away. I left them both stewing in uncertainty. By the time the night ended, I felt a spark of satisfaction that my plan was in motion. Linda showed up the next day, looking wary. We sat in the same living room where we'd shared so many evenings, now haunted by her absence. I didn't bother with small talk. I played the recording of Ramesh admitting the bribe. She went stiff, disbelief and horror wrestling on her face. Then I showed her his signed statement. At first, she insisted it must be a misunderstanding, but as the evidence piled up, her indignation shifted to betrayal. She demanded to know why David would do this. I replied, "He's always wanted what I have. This time, it was you." She broke down in tears, anger and remorse tangling in her voice. "I've been such a fool," she said. "I believed it because I wanted to believe there was something more." I sat there, letting her process the weight of David's deception. After a few minutes, she began apologizing, begging for forgiveness, saying she'd been manipulated. Her words tumbled out in waves. She said she missed me, that she wanted to come home. I watched her cry, but my sympathy had real limits. Betrayal can't be undone with tears. It was time she realized I wouldn't take her back. I told her I understood how she felt, but I also told her she'd made her choice. When she asked if I could ever see us reconciling, I shook my head. I reminded her I'd spent weeks in a fog of misery while she played house with David. She wept, telling me she'd do anything to fix this. I stayed calm and explained I no longer trusted her. Deep in my gut, I realized I wasn't the same person who once adored her without question. This betrayal severed something vital. I said goodbye and asked her to leave my apartment. Of course, David found out about her visit. He called me that evening, half gloating, half enraged. "You couldn't wait to poison her mind, huh?" he spat. I let him rant, quietly smiling at how rattled he sounded. Eventually, I told him, "You should be grateful I haven't sued you yet." There was a silence, then a nervous chuckle. He tried to brush it off as if I was bluffing, but I made sure he understood I had proof of his fraud. With that, I ended the call. My heart pounded with adrenaline, but I felt stronger than I had in months. Linda's shift in perspective was immediate. She cut off David, moving out of his place in a rush. It created a stir in the family, with my parents calling to say Linda showed up crying on their doorstep. She confessed she'd been misled, that David had orchestrated the fiasco. My parents finally understood that their golden boy wasn't so perfect, but I refused to let them pressure me into giving Linda another chance. The damage was done. That might sound cold, but I wanted to respect myself enough not to open that door again. She'd have to live with regret. David tried apologizing too, claiming he'd been caught up in the thrill of winning at something. He said he'd never truly meant to hurt me, he just couldn't stand always being second best. I listened without a shred of pity. Whatever insecurities he battled, he had no right to wreck my life. I told him flat out that our relationship would never be the same. Perhaps in time, I'd learn to tolerate his presence, but we'd never return to brotherly camaraderie. He had opened a wound that wouldn't simply heal. His guilt was his burden. I wouldn't ease that weight. Over the following weeks, Linda bombarded me with texts and voice messages. Each time she'd ask if we could talk, saying she missed me and that she finally saw the truth about David. My replies remained polite but guarded. I had no desire to reignite a romance built on shattered trust. Meanwhile, my lawyer friend reminded me that I still had a strong legal position if I wanted to pursue a civil suit. Part of me considered it, just to make David pay. But I decided to wait, to let them both stew in the consequences of their own bad choices. In the interim, I focused on healing. I hit the gym, reclaiming parts of myself I'd let stagnate. I reconnected with old friends, started new projects at work, and even visited a therapist to sort through the betrayal's emotional fallout. Each day, I grew more certain that I deserved a fresh start, unburdened by those who'd wronged me. Still, the desire for vengeance simmered. When I saw David's social media posts bragging about his big promotion, I felt a flicker of anger. He seemed to bounce back so easily, as though what he did required no true accountability or remorse. That's when I decided to escalate. I knew David had exaggerated parts of his resume to secure that promotion. He'd boasted to me once, drunk at a family gathering, about inflating his sales numbers. I still remembered the details. Over the next few days, I gathered screenshots of his actual performance metrics and compared them to the claims he'd submitted. Then, using a new email address, I anonymously forwarded this information to his HR department. I wasn't proud of stooping to his level, but I felt it was justified. Actions had serious consequences, and he'd learned that lesson soon enough. 2 weeks later, rumors flew that David was under review. A formal investigation was launched. He tried to deny any wrongdoing, but the evidence was undeniable. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that management was furious about his deceit. He was promptly demoted, losing the shiny new title he'd paraded online. The best part was how blindsided he seemed. This was a man used to manipulating situations, and now he was the one cornered. Word got back to me that he suspected I'd exposed him. I didn't confirm or deny it. I went about my life savoring a quiet victory. Linda also faced fallout. Her friends whispered about how gullible she'd been, leaving her marriage for a con. She lost some of their respect, and even her family expressed disappointment. I heard from mutual contacts that she was living alone in a modest studio, trying to piece her life back together. People asked if I'd ever take her back. My answer never changed. I refused to degrade myself by forgiving a betrayal of that magnitude. Love can't survive that kind of wound. Instead, I poured my energy into building a new life, one that didn't revolve around her choices anymore. Occasionally, I still heard Linda's pleas through voicemails. She'd go on about redemption, about how she'd woken up from a terrible dream. She claimed she wanted to fix our marriage properly, but the illusions of soulmates and cosmic alignment had left deep scars on me. I couldn't simply erase the image of her clinging to David on the basis of some astrologer's lie. Every time I replayed that memory, I felt a renewed sense of betrayal. Perhaps some people can forgive. I couldn't, and I wouldn't force myself to pretend otherwise. My heart needed more than regretful words to mend. David eventually left town. He claimed it was for a new job opportunity, but I suspected he couldn't stand the shame. Our parents tried to smooth things over, but I refused to attend the farewell dinner. I wanted nothing to do with his final act of self-pity. Linda stayed behind, and from what I heard, she was trying to pick up the broken pieces. People told me she was depressed, that she regretted everything. Part of me felt a pang of empathy. Once upon a time, I loved her deeply, but I never let that sympathy override the boundaries I'd set. Months passed before I ran into Linda again by chance. I was leaving the grocery store, and she was standing there holding a shopping bag. She looked thinner, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She managed a smile and asked how I was. I told her I was better, working on myself. She nodded and her gaze dropped. She apologized more softly this time, saying she understood if I refused to speak to her. I took a measured breath and said, "I wish you well, but I won't forget what happened." She seemed wounded, but I had nothing more to offer. Afterward, I felt a pang of guilt, but I reminded myself that actions have lasting repercussions. If I let her back in, I'd be telling her betrayal had no real consequences. I'd be diminishing my own worth. Life went on. Work, friends, and personal growth took center stage. I occasionally heard snippets about Linda from family gatherings. She was quieter now, less sure of herself. Sometimes I pitied her, but I never regretted my stance. My boundaries were the only things protecting me from the chaos she and David had unleashed. I wasn't about to let them crumble any further. Eventually, I met someone new. Her name was Claire, and she had a calm confidence that put me at ease. We started dating slowly, neither of us rushing. After the storm I'd weathered, I appreciated her steady warmth, her straightforward honesty. She knew about my past, and she respected my boundaries. Over time, I allowed myself to trust again, bit by bit. I found it liberating to share life with someone who valued me without cosmic gimmicks. We laughed together, built memories, and let our bond grow naturally. In her presence, I rediscovered parts of myself that betrayal had buried. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. Linda's voice came through. She spoke softly, telling me she heard I was seeing someone else. She wanted to congratulate me, she said, but her tone wavered with sadness. She admitted she still loved me, that she'd never stop regretting what happened. I listened for a moment, waiting for anger to flare, but I felt only a distant ache. I thanked her for calling, then reiterated that I'd moved on. She asked if we could be friends someday. I told her I wasn't sure. We ended the call without resolution. Life, as it tends to do, carried on. Claire and I grew closer, solidifying the trust between us. My career advanced, and I found myself smiling more often. I realized that true partnership had nothing to do with horoscopes. It was about respect, honesty, and mutual support. David remained a distant figure, sending occasional holiday messages that I mostly ignored. Linda seemed stuck in a loop of remorse, but I didn't let that define my choices. Over time, the bitterness ebbed. I discovered that living well, finding joy again, was the sweetest form of revenge. No cosmic chart could dictate that. A year later, on a sunny Saturday, Claire and I got engaged. It was simple, a picnic in the park, a heartfelt conversation, and then I slipped a ring on her finger. We toasted with cheap champagne, both laughing at how unpretentious it felt. In that moment, I realized I'd finally let go of the resentment. Linda and David had become chapters in my story, cautionary tales of betrayal and manipulation. But they no longer completely defined me. Standing there with Claire, I felt a joyful sense of fulfillment that astrology could never promise. My future was mine to shape. Looking back, I see how fragile love can be when built on illusions. Linda once believed she had found her soulmate in my brother, all because an astrologer said so. But real love isn't about star signs or forced destiny. It's about choice, honesty, and loyalty, qualities that can't be conjured by a paid reading. In the end, David's deception destroyed the illusion he'd created. Linda discovered too late that I wasn't someone to be cast aside and reclaimed at will. My revenge was never about destroying them, it was about preserving myself, and in doing so, I found true happiness. I still remember the day my children, Clara and Samuel, told me they wouldn't be coming to see me during that first Christmas after my ex-wife Patricia and I finalized our divorce. At the time, I brushed it off as a result of the tension lingering from the separation, reassuring myself that they'd come around once everyone had cooled off. But life has a way of crushing illusions when you least expect it. Instead of a phone call or a last-minute knock at my door, I got silence. An endless, gaping silence that confirmed something I never thought possible. My kids had chosen their mother over me. They had severed ties and moved on, pinning their hopes and loyalties on the shiny new life she had built with her wealthy new husband. I was the father who had spent years reading them bedtime stories, only to be shut out completely. I never saw it coming. So how did we get to that point? That's a question I've spent countless sleepless nights asking myself. We were a typical suburban family once, 2 kids, a dog named Lucky, and a well-maintained lawn. I was working as an accountant, Patricia was a high school English teacher, and the kids spent their time bouncing between soccer practices, music lessons, and weekend birthday parties. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, something had started rotting away. It turned out Patricia had grown bored with our life and even bored with me. She'd fallen for a client at the private tutoring sessions she did to earn extra income. He was charismatic, successful, and unbelievably wealthy. By the time I found out about the affair, she had already set the stage for our downfall. She seemed so certain that her new path was worth destroying our family for. I won't forget the day I confronted her in our living room. She didn't even bother denying it. She merely sighed, looked me straight in the eyes, and told me she deserved more than the half-baked existence I was giving her. I might have shouted, I can't remember. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the glass of water I'd been holding. Then came the arguments, the ones that rattled the walls and scarred the children. I tried to salvage our marriage. I proposed therapy, time off from work, maybe a rekindling trip to the very place we had honeymooned. Nothing swayed her. Patricia was already mentally packed, destined for a world where my modest income as an accountant paled in comparison to the zeros in that man's bank account. And so, we got the lawyers involved, we divided up our lives, and we signed those dreaded divorce papers. Together. Initially, I thought the kids would stay neutral, or at least give me the benefit of the doubt. Clara was 16 and Samuel was 14 at the time, old enough to have opinions, but still too young to fully grasp adult complexities. For a while, I tried to shield them from the ugliness of it all, but Patricia didn't do the same. She blamed me for everything, painting me as the unambitious, complacent husband who couldn't keep up with her dreams. She regaled them with stories of her new partner's successful business ventures, the exotic places he'd taken her, the expensive gifts he showered on both her and them. When I tried to explain my side, they shrugged, uninterested. In their eyes, their mother had found something better, and I was just the guy who had failed to deliver. I never thought my own children would view me that way, ever. The divorce settlement was relatively straightforward. I let Patricia keep the house because I couldn't bear the suffocating memories that clung to every corner. I moved into a small apartment near my workplace. At first, Clara and Samuel visited on weekends. They were polite but distant, as though I were an old acquaintance rather than their father. Then Patricia's new husband, Richard, swept in like a fairy godfather, offering them lucrative part-time positions at his tech company. Overnight, my children were rubbing elbows with CEOs and living in a world where private jets were a weekend treat. They had a taste of money, power, and high society. My phone calls to them became less frequent. Sometimes Clara would answer, sometimes she wouldn't. Samuel always seemed too busy. Gradually, the visits stopped entirely. I tried to stay patient, but deep down, I knew I was losing them for good, forevermore. I didn't realize how far they drifted until I got wind of Clara's wedding through a distant relative. By then, she was in her early 20s, working full-time at Richard's firm, and enjoying a lifestyle I could never compete with. She had the perfect dress, the perfect venue, and the perfect guest list, one that did not include her biological father. The rejection cut deeper than I imagined it would. When I confronted her over the phone, she told me it was a family affair and that I would make things awkward. After that, I stopped calling altogether. I didn't want to beg for scraps of their attention, nor did I want to humiliate myself by forcing my presence where it was obviously unwelcome. A year later, I heard that Samuel got married too, also without a single word of invitation to me. It felt like a final, irrevocable disownment and heartbreak. They haven't spoken to me in 8 years now. You might wonder why I didn't try harder, why I didn't push back or fight for my parental rights. Truth is, I did, for a while. But there comes a point when you realize you can't force love or respect. If your own children look at you like an unwanted intruder, you can only stand so many rejections before you close the door yourself. I won't deny that I fell into a depression. I went from being a father of 2 to a solitary man with no immediate family. Memories of them tugged at me constantly, mocking me with each passing day. When I saw families at the mall or fathers playing catch in the park, I felt a stab of envy so deep it almost made me physically ill. But you can't cry about it forever, can you? I refused, though, so I rebuilt myself one piece at a time. I focused on my career, took on extra certifications, and eventually landed a better position at a mid-sized financial firm. I made decent money, managed to move into a nicer condo, and even started traveling a bit. With each passing year, I inched further away from the broken man I used to be. I found new hobbies: gardening, cooking elaborate meals for myself, and occasionally volunteering at a local charity. Did I think about them? Of course. But I learned to compartmentalize, storing the heartbreak in a sealed mental box labeled "Do Not Open." Over time, I perfected the art of functioning without hope of reconciliation. I told myself I was better off without their pity or half-hearted relationships. If they wanted me out of their lives so badly, I would respect their choice, or at least pretend to. I had to, but fate has a dark sense of humor. A month ago, I received an email from an unknown sender. At first, I assumed it was spam until I recognized the name: Samuel. He wrote that Richard's company was in financial trouble, some scandal involving embezzlement. Their mother was beside herself. They didn't know what to do. He asked if I could use my accounting expertise to help them figure out what was going on. He claimed he was reaching out because he trusted me more than he ever trusted Richard. If he hoped I would jump at the chance to fix their problems, he was mistaken. I read that email 3 times, letting my anger simmer. 8 years of silence, and now they came to me, not out of love or remorse, but purely out of desperation. Did they think I was some convenient safety net they could exploit? Not anymore. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stewed in my resentment, recalling every unanswered call, every missed holiday, every wedding invitation that never arrived. They wanted me now? Because their golden meal ticket was cracking under legal scrutiny? I felt a spark ignite, a vindictive urge I didn't know I still possessed. For years, I tried to bury my bitterness. I'd convinced myself that moving on was the healthiest option. But sometimes, justice demands a different approach. Let them squirm. Let them face the consequences of turning their backs on me. Maybe that was wrong, morally questionable at best, but it felt good to consider. I wasn't the naive father desperate for a crumb of their affection anymore. I was a man who had rebuilt his life from the ashes they left behind. My phone pinged again a few days later, another email, this time from Clara, echoing Samuel's pleas. I simply smiled in rage. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I opened Clara's email and read her frantic words. She wrote about a federal investigation looming over Richard's company, how the employees' accounts were frozen, how her own bank assets might be seized if the scandal pointed to widespread financial misconduct. She admitted she was scared, that she didn't trust Richard's legal team. She didn't say she was sorry for cutting me out of her life. There was no apology anywhere in that email, just fear and desperation, and a plea for help. In that moment, I realized that all those fatherly instincts I'd tried so hard to kill off weren't entirely dead. A tiny voice in my head whispered that my children needed me, even if they had made me an outcast. But then another voice, colder and sharper, reminded me of the years of betrayal and silence. I clenched my fists. I wrote back a single sentence: "I'll think about it." Then I busied myself with work, half expecting them to flood my inbox with more pleas. But days passed, and I heard nothing. Perhaps they were waiting for me to come to a decision. Perhaps they were too proud to beg further. I imagined Patricia pacing in her lavish living room, anxious for any sign of salvation. I pictured Richard, once so confident and smug, now cornered by allegations he couldn't shrug off. And my children, my own flesh and blood, caught in the crossfire. A part of me wanted to swoop in and save them, to prove I was the better person. But another part, the one still tasting the bitterness of abandonment, craved retribution. Why should I rescue them when they'd been so eager to cast me aside? I was torn, and I hated myself for it. I paced for hours. Ultimately, I decided to investigate. Not to save them, exactly, but to see what kind of trouble they were in. Using my professional networks, I accessed public records and rumors swirling around Richard's enterprise. The man had been funneling money through shell companies, forging invoices and inflating expenses to hide massive profits. It was only a matter of time before the authorities closed in. Clara and Samuel, as employees with signatory roles, could be implicated. The scale of the fraud was staggering, and if found guilty, Richard faced serious prison time. My children's assets and freedoms dangled on a precarious edge. As I delved deeper, I wrestled with my conscience. Did I want to help them find a loophole, or did I want to hand them over to the wolves? A cunning plan began to form in my mind, one that would satisfy my lingering thirst for justice and revenge. I arranged a meeting with Clara and Samuel under the guise of discussing a strategy. They suggested a fancy restaurant in the city, but I insisted on a quiet cafe near my office, neutral ground. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. Designer suits, expensive watches, an air of entitlement that made my stomach churn. They offered awkward hugs and forced smiles, as though we were estranged coworkers rather than family. Over lattes, they laid out the documents, pointing to ledger discrepancies and bank statements. Clara's voice trembled as she confessed her fear of going to prison. Samuel kept tapping his foot under the table, the tension visible in his clenched jaw. Still, not once did they say, "Dad, we're sorry." Instead, they spoke as if I was an outsourced expert, someone they could hire for damage control. My resentment grew with every syllable they uttered. I felt numb. I told them I'd look into possible solutions. Privately, I resolved to do so in a way that would not only expose Richard, but leave my children questioning the loyalties they'd chosen. I spent weeks poring over the data. Yes, I could have arranged a settlement or found a legal loophole to minimize the fallout, but something in me refused to let them off that easily. Instead, I gathered proof. Emails linking Richard's fraudulent transactions directly to his personal accounts, recordings of phone calls where he instructed staff to manipulate financial statements. As for Clara and Samuel, I ensured their involvement looked minimal while highlighting Richard's manipulative tactics. I wanted them to see the full scope of his betrayal, to realize that the man they idolized was the very one who might ruin their lives. If they learned a lesson about blind loyalty, so be it. I felt no mercy. Ever. On the day I handed over my findings, I could see the color drain from their faces. Clara's eyes filled with tears when she realized just how deep Richard's corruption ran. Samuel's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. I told them they had a choice: cooperate with investigators and reveal Richard's tactics, or face possible charges themselves. They looked at me like frightened children again, searching for reassurance. But I couldn't summon any paternal comfort. Instead, I told them the truth. If they wanted to save themselves, they needed to cut ties with their mother's husband. They needed to testify if necessary. As for me, I'd provide the documents to the authorities, ensuring that Richard took the brunt of the fall. Whether Clara or Samuel wanted to maintain contact with me afterward was up to them. I offered no solace. Ever. They did cooperate to an extent. Within weeks, Richard was indicted, his assets frozen, and the media had a field day unraveling his decade-long empire of lies. I later learned that Patricia's lavish lifestyle crumbled practically overnight. The house, the cars, the jewels, all seized. My kids were questioned, but ultimately released without charges, thanks to the evidence I'd provided showing they were pawns, not co-conspirators. Once the dust settled, Clara called me. I expected gratitude, but all I heard was devastation. She said Patricia blamed me for destroying their lives, that I had acted out of spite. Then she broke down crying, asking if I could ever forgive them. I stood there, phone in hand, my heart pounding. For a moment, I felt a pang of the old paternal love, but it was overshadowed by the memory of 8 silent years. I let her cry. I offered no comfort again. You might judge me for that, but betrayal changes a person. For years, I was nothing more than a ghost in their lives, overshadowed by wealth and a mother's manipulations. Did I want revenge? Yes, and I got it. Richard was behind bars, Patricia lost her kingdom, and my children were forced to confront their own moral failures. Some might say I was cruel not to embrace them the moment they came back. But forgiveness isn't an obligation. It's a privilege given to those who've earned it. Clara and Samuel made their bed when they chose their mother's money over my love. They only returned when their new world collapsed. I refused to be a backup plan. I refused to let them think they could treat me as disposable. Sometimes you have to protect your heart, even from your own flesh and blood. That was my reality. I slept soundly afterward. Months passed. I occasionally received voicemails from Clara or Samuel, but they never seemed sure what to say. Patricia apparently filed for bankruptcy. Richard remained in custody, awaiting trial. The media circus moved on to other scandals, leaving my family in a quiet ruin. Sometimes I wondered if I should reach out, extend an olive branch. But then I'd remember the holidays spent alone, the empty mailbox that should have been stuffed with wedding invitations, the birthdays they never cared to celebrate with me. A man can only endure so much before his heart becomes a fortified fortress. I had no interest in letting them tear down my walls again. Maybe one day they'll earn my trust back, but it won't be through hollow apologies or convenient loyalty. It'll take genuine effort and remorse. Until then, I remain resolute in my decision. I owe them nothing. My pride is unwavering. So here I stand, 8 years after being exiled from my own children's lives, with the knowledge that I stayed true to myself. In the end, we make our choices, and we must live with the consequences. My kids chose their mother's money, and I chose my self-respect. Do I regret it? Sometimes. Late at night, when the house is silent and my mind wanders, I think about what might have been if things had gone differently. But regret is a corrosive emotion, and I refuse to let it dominate my life. I have no illusions that we'll ever be a happy family again. That bridge was burned long ago by their own hands as much as mine. Still, I continue on, carving out a life that doesn't revolve around their approval. Maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. No one can take your dignity unless you let them. Never. I remember the day I first suspected something was off in my marriage. It wasn't a dramatic scene or an obvious betrayal. It was a fleeting look between my wife, Sylvia, and my cousin Mark during a family cookout. They had always been close. We all grew up together, playing in the yard, sharing jokes, building childhood memories that formed the bedrock of our relationship. I chalked up the strange moment to stress, maybe tension from an argument I didn't know about, or perhaps I was misreading the situation. After all, I thought, we'd all been raised to look out for each other. Blood was thicker than water, right? Looking back, I feel foolish for being so blind. If I'd been more alert, I might have confronted the truth. But denial often finds a comfortable home in love and routine. We choose what we want to see until we can't. In truth, I was too busy with work to notice the cracks forming beneath my roof. I had a small tech startup that demanded every ounce of my attention. Late nights coding, early mornings on calls with potential investors. I was determined to make my company a success. Sylvia said she understood. She seemed proud whenever I mentioned the sacrifices I had to make for our future. Mark, on the other hand, was the golden boy of the family, beloved for his charm and quick wit. He always knew how to make my parents laugh, how to lighten any tense conversation. He was the cousin everyone admired, but also teased for his restless spirit. He jumped from job to job, drifting without a clear purpose. At least, that was the impression he gave me. If only I had known where his real focus lay and how it involved my wife. Suspicion grew gradually, an itch in my mind that flared up whenever Mark dropped by unannounced, or whenever Sylvia found excuses to leave a family gathering early. I told myself I was being paranoid. A man under constant pressure can mistake fatigue for jealousy. Still, the tension was there. My parents, older now, seemed oblivious. They adored Sylvia and Mark equally, praising them for supporting me in my entrepreneurial endeavors. My mother would gush about how lucky I was to have a wife who accepted my drive to succeed and a cousin who stepped in to help around the house whenever I was gone. Eventually, though, little signs became harder to ignore. A hushed phone call in the kitchen, a text that Sylvia quickly hid when I walked in, and those lingering glances between the two of them. By that time, my startup was on the verge of a breakthrough. News of our product's potential skyrocketed all my credibility almost overnight. Investors scheduled meetings back to back. I was traveling across the country to pitch, forging new partnerships, and rubbing shoulders with venture capitalists who saw a glimmer in my work. Meanwhile, Mark's presence at our home became more frequent. My parents absolutely never questioned it because to them, Mark was just being helpful. Sylvia kept saying she was fine, that she was proud of me for going after our dreams. Looking back, she must have been laughing behind my back, realizing how easy it was to deceive me. I won't deny it. The idea of her betrayal never crossed my mind, at least not fully. I always believed our marriage was built on trust. I had grown complacent, so wrapped up in my professional ambitions that I failed to notice the personal storm brewing right under my nose. Then, everything exploded. I came home from a work trip a day early, hoping to surprise Sylvia with dinner reservations at her favorite restaurant. The house was strangely quiet. No TV, no music, just an oppressive stillness. I walked to our bedroom, expecting to find her napping or maybe scrolling on her phone. Instead, I caught Mark slipping out of our bed. My bed. He was half-dressed, fumbling to pull his shirt over his head while she scrambled to cover herself with the sheets. It's amazing how a single moment can shatter your entire world. I felt my heart pound so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My mind froze, refusing to process what my eyes were screaming was true. That was the instant I realized my deepest fears were more than nightmares. They were my new reality. Sylvia started crying. Mark mumbled something about it being a terrible mistake. I said nothing. Not at first. Rage like I had never felt before, white-hot, searing rage coursed through me, but I was frozen. It was almost out of body. I saw myself stepping aside, letting Mark bolt past me and out the front door. Sylvia tried to come closer, tears streaming down her face. She kept repeating my name like a broken chant. But I couldn't stand the sight of her. My fists clenched until my knuckles turned white. A pounding in my ears drowned out her sobs, her frantic explanations, everything. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, cold and unrecognizable. I told her to get dressed and leave. She tried to protest, said we could talk it out. But there was nothing left to say. As she packed a bag, I stared at the bedsheets, searching for some hint of the love we'd once had. Soon after, my parents and relatives heard what had happened. My mother cried, insisting there had to be a misunderstanding. My father scolded me for jumping to conclusions. For a moment, I wondered if I was in some alternate universe. Here I was, the wronged husband, yet my own parents doubted my story. I learned that Mark had already gone to them, spinning a version of events that painted him and Sylvia as a momentary lapse, a mistake fueled by confusion and stress. Somehow, my family was more inclined to believe that narrative than the truth I'd witnessed with my own eyes. My anger grew. This was not just a betrayal by Sylvia and Mark, but a betrayal by those closest to me who refused to support me in my darkest hour. I confronted them, demanding they at least acknowledge my pain. They mumbled apologies, but never took my side. Sylvia disappeared for a while, moving in with some friends. I buried myself in work. The startup was booming, and I poured every ounce of grief, rage, and betrayal into perfecting our product. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of her and Mark, but my waking hours were dedicated to forging a success no one could question. My parents told me I was being dramatic, that I should meet Sylvia halfway. They said that marriages aren't always perfect, and that people make mistakes. It was like they had no comprehension of the absolute gravity of what she'd done. In quiet moments, I wondered if I would ever recover. The heartbreak was a gaping wound, and their lack of understanding poured salt into it. Even so, I pressed on. My drive to succeed became my lifeline. I swore I'd never let anyone take advantage of my vulnerability again, with unwavering intensity. A few months passed, and that's when another bombshell dropped. I discovered Sylvia was pregnant. At first, I assumed it was mine because the timeline roughly fit with our last intimacy. But as the weeks went on, a gnawing doubt crept into my mind. Deep down, I suspected the child could be Mark's. When I confronted Sylvia, she broke down, admitting it was indeed Mark's baby. She told me this with tears running down her cheeks, as if that could possibly soften the blow. I was furious beyond words. To me, this sealed the final coffin of our marriage. There was no going back from this. But the real twist came when my parents and other relatives tried to convince me to accept the child as my own. They said family was everything. I realized then just how so far they'd go at any cost to protect Mark and Sylvia. I cut ties with them all, once and forever. If they could side with betrayal, they would live with its consequences. I moved out of state, taking my startup with me. The business was thriving, and I took the opportunity to rebrand and expand. Within 2 years, I had opened a new headquarters in a bustling city, hired a brilliant team, and secured lucrative contracts. My personal life was a mess, but my professional life soared. I threw my energy into making the company a symbol of my comeback, a testament to my refusal to be broken by infidelity and family disloyalty. Meanwhile, Sylvia gave birth to a healthy son. Through the grapevine, I heard Mark struggled to keep a job and that my family continued to enable him. I told myself I was done with them, that I would never again be pulled into their drama or their manipulations. Years passed. My startup blossomed into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, attracting acclaim in tech circles. I bought a house in an upscale neighborhood, traveled the world for conferences, and spoke on panels about entrepreneurship. Internally, though, I still carried that old wound. Sometimes I would see a happy couple at an airport or restaurant, and a pang of sadness would tear through me. I wouldn't let it consume me, but it was a reminder of what I'd lost and what had been taken from me by people I once trusted. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang one evening. It was my mother. She sounded frail, older than I remembered. She said the family had fallen on hard times, that Mark was out of money, Sylvia was struggling to raise her son, and they all regretted what had happened. She ended with a plea for me to come home and help. I felt a surge of bitterness flood my chest. After all these years of silence, they wanted my support. They had picked their side long ago. Now they needed my money, my resources, my influence. I asked my mother if she was truly sorry about the past, or if it was just desperation. She cried, saying she had no power over how things played out then, but now she wanted to make amends. I didn't give an answer right away. Instead, I told her I'd think about it. After the call, I paced my living room, reliving every painful memory. Sylvia's betrayal, Mark's cowardly escape, my parents' disbelief, and that damn child who symbolized the ultimate betrayal. I wasn't sure I wanted to see any of them again. Part of me wanted them to suffer as I had, but a tiny sliver of me wondered if closure was truly possible. Over the next week, I wrestled with my decision. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my mother, sometimes my father, occasionally an aunt or uncle. All of them insisted that Mark had changed, that he realized he'd made a terrible mistake, that Sylvia was remorseful. I remembered the day she told me about her pregnancy, tears in her eyes, as though regret alone could erase the betrayal. I also recalled how my family had rallied around them instead of me. With each new call, I felt an odd mix of satisfaction and disgust. They were at my mercy now, needing my financial help. One evening, I poured myself a stiff drink and stared at my reflection in the window. I thought about redemption, about whether it was possible for them, or even for me. Ultimately, I decided to return to my hometown to really see the situation for myself. When I arrived, the town felt smaller than ever. My parents' home was worn and in need of repairs. My mother greeted me tearfully, hugging me as though she was afraid I'd vanish again. My father stood awkwardly in the doorway, offering a curt nod. Inside, I noticed old photos still hung on the walls, snapshots from a time when the family was intact. Mark was there, looking gaunt and nervous. He approached me, eyes downcast, mumbling an apology. I didn't respond. The sight of him made my blood simmer. I remembered him fleeing my bedroom that day like a coward. Sylvia was absent, which was a relief. I sat in the living room, letting my parents explain how Mark had lost job after job, how medical bills for the child had piled up, and how they'd nearly lost the house. They needed my help very badly, financially and emotionally. I looked each of them in the eye and stated plainly that I owed them nothing. My mother started to cry, but I refused to budge. They had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. Now they expected me to bail them out? Mark tried to speak, but I silenced him with a glare. I reminded them how they defended him, how they brushed aside my trauma. My father mumbled that family was all they had. I shot back that they should have remembered that when I was the one in pain. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, I told them I was willing to pay for the house repairs, but only under the condition that Mark and Sylvia never contact me again, and that they sign a legal agreement removing me from any future obligations. My mother and father looked shocked and deeply stunned. Before they could protest, I made it clear that I didn't care what happened to Mark, nor did I wish to meet Sylvia or her child. My mother begged me to reconsider, talking about forgiveness and second chances. But I stood firm. Forgiveness was off the table. I'd grown too much, endured too much, to pretend that words could heal that old wound. My father tried to intervene, but I told him that he lost the right to counsel me the day he doubted my pain. The tension thickened until Mark quietly left the room. A short while later, he returned with a worn folder containing documents. He was ready to sign whatever I wanted, he said. Desperation clung to his voice. I realized then how far he had fallen and how little pity remained in my heart. He caused his own downfall when he chose to completely betray me. I handed him the agreement I had prepared, detailing the financial assistance for the house and my parents' upkeep in exchange for permanent estrangement. He would never again approach me, call me, or show up in my life. Sylvia, too, was banned from contacting me. If they broke these terms, they'd owe me everything I had paid plus legal fees. Mark signed without reading the fine print, too desperate to salvage whatever remained of his dignity. My father watched in silence, and my mother sobbed. I half expected them to protest the harshness of my terms, but they said nothing. Maybe they realized it was a small price to pay for their survival. Once the papers were signed, I wrote a check for the house repairs and some living expenses. I also gave them a date by which I would no longer be reachable. After that date, all communication must cease. My mother tried one last time to gain my sympathy, saying she hoped I could find it in my heart to be a part of her grandson's life. The audacity was staggering. That child was the product of Sylvia and Mark's treachery, and no amount of tears would make me forget. I simply shook my head and stood to leave. My father muttered something about how I was letting anger ruin the family. I reminded him that the family had been completely ruined the moment they chose deception over loyalty. Leaving the house felt like stepping out of a graveyard. I never looked back. The next day, I made the necessary bank transfers, ensuring my parents were financially stable. I got into my car, drove back to the airport, and flew home, feeling a sense of finality I hadn't felt in years. My old life was once and truly over, completely. In the months that followed, I focused on new horizons. I developed additional products, acquired smaller startups, and invested in various philanthropic endeavors to fill the void I felt inside. I dated occasionally, but no relationship lasted long. Trust was a scarce commodity in my world. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't entirely whole either. I figured that was the price of heartbreak. Once in a while, I'd still catch myself browsing social media for glimpses into my old circle, but I never found much. Mark and Sylvia appeared to have disappeared from the digital sphere, and my parents rarely posted anything. My mother tried calling me once, on a blocked number, but I hung up as soon as I recognized her voice. My boundaries were set. I wouldn't let the past keep me from building a future, but I also wouldn't forget the lessons I'd paid for in blood. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not giving them another chance. I tell them no. My peace was hard-won, and I see no reason to risk it for those who betrayed me. There's something liberating about knowing exactly where you stand with the world. My success no longer feels like a shield. It's simply a reflection of the resilience I found within myself. In time, I might love again, but I will never forget the day I walked into my bedroom and saw the truth laid bare. That memory guides me, reminding me that trust is precious and must be guarded. If revenge is defined by living on my own terms, free of their lies and manipulations, then I have certainly tasted its sweetness. And that, I believe, is all the closure I'll ever need. That knowledge sustains me every day. The chapter is closed, and I'm finally free. I never suspected Isaac, my fiance's best friend, of harboring any ill will toward me. When I first met him, he shook my hand and flashed what I perceived as a genuine smile. He was charming in an effortless way, tall, easygoing, always ready with a quick joke. My fiancé, Marcus, respected him deeply, credited him with guiding him through tough times. I wanted to trust that friendship. At first, everything seemed harmless, but soon, behind closed doors, Isaac's tone shifted. Small jabs at my style, jokes about my cooking, questions about my intelligence, each left a sting. I should have realized sooner. For a time, I brushed off those small comments. I told myself that Isaac was joking, that I was too sensitive, or that I needed to learn to laugh at myself. My fiancé was busy finishing his graduate program, and I didn't want to cast any shadows on his friendship. But those jabs grew sharper when we were alone. Isaac would tell me I was only with Marcus for financial security. He'd say my jokes fell flat in public. He even insisted my provincial upbringing made me unworthy of marrying into Marcus's family. It wore me down, piece by piece. I confided in my best friend Genevieve, who listened quietly before admitting she'd overheard Isaac mocking me at a party. He joked to a group of acquaintances that I was a gold digger with the personality of stale bread. Her words stung, but they also validated my growing suspicions. Isaac wasn't just teasing me, he was telling others horrible things behind my back. My heartbreak turned into anger when Genevieve described how everyone had laughed. I felt humiliated and alone, uncertain how to handle someone so entrenched in my fiancé's life. I wanted to keep the peace, but his cruelty festered. Months passed and I tried different tactics. I tried kindness, baking him cookies or asking about his day, hoping a gentle approach might soften his hostility. He'd politely thank me in Marcus's presence, but roll his eyes when Marcus walked away. I tried ignoring him, limiting my responses to curt nods. That only emboldened him. Then I made small attempts to stand up for myself, but each time, he'd twist my words to make me appear irrational or oversensitive. The strain began infecting my relationship with Marcus. I could sense him growing tired of the tension whenever Isaac was around. Finally, one night, after Isaac had delivered another passive-aggressive comment about my intelligence, I pulled Marcus aside. I explained that I felt harassed, that Isaac wasn't merely joking. Marcus looked conflicted. He admitted Isaac could be blunt, but insisted he didn't believe Isaac meant harm. His hesitation to confront his best friend hurt me, but I persisted, detailing how I felt belittled, how it had been happening for months. Marcus seemed unsettled but promised he'd speak to Isaac in private. I felt a flicker of relief, imagining Isaac might back off if his behavior was finally addressed head-on. That night. The next morning, Marcus told me he'd confronted Isaac, who apparently denied everything. Isaac claimed I had misinterpreted his light-hearted humor. He also said I was trying to sabotage his and Marcus's friendship because I was jealous of their closeness. Hearing that twisted version of reality made my anger flare. Marcus pressed him further, but Isaac insisted I was too sensitive, cautioning Marcus to be wary of how I might control him in the future. Marcus seemed torn. He believed me, but Isaac's manipulative words had planted doubt. It was a day of heartbreak and a night of restless sleep. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere worsened. Isaac's remarks became less covert, yet he was careful never to show his true colors in front of Marcus's parents or other important people. He consistently undermined me, belittling my job, claiming I was incompetent at simple tasks. Once, when I arranged a small get-together, he told everyone I used store-bought food and lied about cooking it myself. His accusations baffled me, but the damage was done. The guests laughed awkwardly, and I felt humiliated again. Each incident seemed small, yet together they formed a nightmarish web I struggled to escape. I felt trapped. Even though I'd pleaded with Marcus for support, he was caught in a haze of loyalty. He acknowledged Isaac's behavior was odd, but he also felt indebted to him. They had history, school years spent supporting each other's dreams, family vacations, late-night phone calls. Marcus loved me, but Isaac was a brother to him. That emotional bond made Marcus hesitate to believe how sinister Isaac's behavior actually was. Sometimes, I caught Marcus glancing at me with concern, as if he wanted to help but wasn't sure how. Meanwhile, Isaac's attacks escalated and I felt cornered, powerless to protect myself fully, completely. One evening, I found Isaac in my apartment building's lobby, waiting for me. Marcus wasn't home. Isaac tried to appear casual, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, but there was a tension about him that made my stomach churn. He stated that he knew I was stirring up drama between him and Marcus, and he warned me to stop. He accused me of manipulating Marcus with my fragile act. I was shocked that he'd confront me alone, but I refused to yield. I told him to leave. He smirked, stepped closer, and said if I dared continue, I'd regret it. I trembled with rage and fear after he left. That night, I lay awake recalling how Isaac once boasted he'd do anything to protect Marcus from bad influences. Now, I realized he saw me as the ultimate threat. I decided it was time to gather evidence of his manipulation. If I could present something concrete to Marcus, he'd have no choice but to see the truth. Over the next few weeks, I started discreetly recording Isaac's verbal assaults whenever we were alone. I saved screenshots of hateful text messages he sent me. I began building my case piece by piece. Unexpectedly, Isaac attempted a new tactic. He began telling people I was the one harassing him. He'd mention how I'd corner him at gatherings, accusing him of nonsense. He painted himself as a victim, claiming I was trying to turn Marcus against him out of jealousy. The rumors spread quickly through our social circles. People I barely knew started glancing at me with suspicion, as though I were a conniving intruder. Meanwhile, Isaac's hostility remained constant in private. He'd deliver spiteful whispers under his breath, reminding me nobody would believe my side. My frustration and anxiety grew by the day. Marcus stood by me the best he could, but Isaac had been his friend for so many years. Seeds of doubt had taken root in Marcus's mind, and no matter how much I insisted Isaac was tormenting me, a part of him wanted to believe Isaac was innocent. The confusion tested our relationship. I tried to be patient, but inside, resentment grew. I felt betrayed by Marcus's hesitation to see Isaac's malice. Yet, I also knew Isaac had perfected the art of manipulation, weaving half-truths into plausible stories. We were stuck in limbo, neither fully believing nor disbelieving each other. One fateful morning, Isaac exploded in a public setting, ironically providing exactly what I needed. We were at a brunch hosted by Marcus's cousin, Helena. Surrounded by family and close friends, Isaac decided to challenge me. He made a cutting remark about me being emotionally unstable, claiming I'd thrown a fit over a misplaced coffee mug. I calmly asked him to clarify. He launched into a tirade, calling me a liar, a manipulator, and accusing me of abusing Marcus. The room fell silent. People stared wide-eyed. Marcus demanded Isaac explain himself, but Isaac escalated, yelling about how I'd ruined everything. In that moment, I played my trump card. I took out my phone and played one of Isaac's recordings. The audio crackled through the room, capturing Isaac's voice spewing insults, laughing at how nobody would ever believe me. Several in the crowd exchanged shocked looks. Marcus's face paled as he recognized Isaac's words. Undeniably hateful, undeniably real. Isaac's rage turned to panic when he realized people were hearing his cruelty firsthand. Before he could respond, I showed the text messages. I read out his threats, exposing the twisted narrative he'd built. My heart pounded, but I felt an empowering certainty. Finally, Isaac tried to spin things again, this time stammering that I'd taken things out of context. He insisted those were jokes, that I'd edited the audio, that I was gaslighting everyone, but the evidence was undeniable. Helena quietly asked Isaac to leave, her eyes flickering with disgust. Marcus looked at me, his eyes welling with tears, then turned to Isaac, fury brimming. Isaac hurried out, threatening that he wasn't done, that he'd tell Marcus's parents I was toxic and get them involved. The room buzzed with stunned whispers. For the first time, people saw the real Isaac behind the mask. Outside, Marcus confronted him, demanding he stop these lies. According to Helena, who followed them out, Isaac threatened legal action and insisted he'd contact Marcus's parents immediately. Marcus told Isaac to never speak to him again. I stood in the doorway, my mind buzzing with relief and anger. I'd wanted Marcus to defend me, and now he was, but the damage was done. I was tired of being victimized. As Isaac stormed off, he shot me a glare so hateful it made my skin crawl. That was the moment I decided revenge was not just an option, it was necessary. Absolutely. Marcus apologized profusely, saying he never imagined Isaac could stoop to such cruelty. He vowed to cut ties completely. However, Isaac's threat to involve his parents loomed over us. Marcus's parents were conservative, proud, and wealthy. They had always been polite to me, but I sensed their wariness, especially about my working-class background. Isaac knew exactly where to strike. I suspected he'd feed them a toxic narrative, painting me as a gold-digging abuser. I refused to let that stand. I decided if Isaac wanted a war, I would fight back. My revenge would be slow, steady, and absolutely final. Indeed, through a mutual acquaintance, I discovered Isaac was deeply invested in a new business venture, an upscale bar he was co-founding. It was his dream project, one he bragged about incessantly. Rumor had it he'd poured nearly all his savings into it. If it failed, he'd be ruined financially. I collected every shred of evidence of Isaac's bullying, including the recordings, texts, and even testimonies from people who'd witnessed his aggression. I made discreet inquiries to potential investors, sharing concerns about Isaac's character. His prospective partners, serious entrepreneurs who valued reputation, were unsettled by the possibility of scandal. Doors began slamming shut, rapidly. Simultaneously, I discovered Isaac had been inflating his credentials to impress these investors. He'd claimed advanced business degrees, prestigious awards, and connections he simply did not have. So I compiled documentation proving his lies, university records, statements from organizations he'd never worked with, and contradictory social media posts. I sent them anonymously to a few influential figures in the local business scene. Soon, word spread that Isaac was not only volatile, but also dishonest. I didn't have to shout my revenge from the rooftops. Careful whispers did the damage. Isaac's business partners began to withdraw, leaving him increasingly desperate. Very desperate. Meanwhile, Isaac's threat to involve Marcus's parents escalated. He sent them a long email about my supposed cruelty, painting me as manipulative and harmful. Fortunately, by now, Marcus had fully grasped Isaac's duplicity. Marcus preemptively showed his parents the evidence of Isaac's bullying. They were stunned, especially by the recordings. Though they were reserved people, they apologized for ever doubting me. They told Isaac they wanted no part in his vendetta. Losing their support was a significant blow to Isaac. Once his strongest allies, they now kept him at arm's length, wary of his unpredictability. It was glorious vindication. Indeed, in a final act of desperation, Isaac confronted me outside a coffee shop one afternoon. His face was gaunt, his hair disheveled. He sneered, accusing me of destroying his life. I responded with calm resolve, telling him he'd brought this on himself. Nobody forced him to harass me, to spread lies, or to threaten my relationship. He spat insults, claiming he'd sue me for defamation. I informed him I had proof to counter any false claims he made. Realizing he had no leverage, his expression crumpled. For a moment, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Then he slunk away. From what I've heard since, Isaac's business venture collapsed entirely. Investors withdrew, prospective clients vanished, and rumors of his dishonesty circulated. He ended up selling his share at a loss. His reputation took a nosedive, leaving him isolated and financially strained. Meanwhile, Marcus and I moved forward with our wedding plans, free from Isaac's toxic interference. We decided on a small ceremony, surrounded by people who genuinely supported us. Watching Isaac's downfall didn't fill me with remorse. Rather, I felt vindicated, relieved that his bullying had been exposed. I gave him no forgiveness, only the consequence of his own cruelty. Occasionally, friends ask if I regret punishing him so thoroughly. Perhaps, they suggest, I should have shown mercy. But I remember the nights I cried myself to sleep, dreading every encounter with him. I remember how he twisted reality, how he nearly convinced Marcus I was a manipulative fraud. I recall the rage and humiliation when people whispered about my alleged cruelty. No, I don't regret it. Isaac earned his downfall. In the end, he exposed his own vile nature. I refused to forgive him, and that refusal granted me power. It reinforced my belief in my own worth, completely. In the aftermath, life settled into a calmer rhythm. I focused on my career, taking on new challenges without Isaac's sabotage. Marcus and I grew closer than ever, strengthened by the ordeal. We learned how vital trust and communication are, especially when outside forces attack a relationship. There were days I still felt the echo of Isaac's insults, but each time I reminded myself how I'd stood my ground. I refused to be a victim, and ultimately, I had emerged victorious. As wedding preparations continued, I felt a renewed sense of self-worth, no longer haunted by Isaac's shadow. And nevermore. When the wedding day arrived, there was no drama, no hint of Isaac. Friends and family celebrated joyously. Genevieve gave a moving toast, recalling how I'd battled adversity and come out stronger. Marcus's parents approached me, expressing both gratitude and regret. They regretted not seeing Isaac's true face sooner, and they were grateful I'd remained steadfast. Marcus himself held my hands, tears in his eyes, promising we'd always face challenges together. A wave of relief washed over me. Isaac's shadows felt distant now. I had won, not by stooping to his level, but by exposing his villainy for all to see. Afterward, life continued. Isaac remained a distant specter, a cautionary tale for anyone who tried to undermine my integrity. Sometimes I spotted him in social media posts, looking withdrawn and embittered. Rumor had it he left town, seeking to rebuild elsewhere. It didn't matter to me anymore. My life was filled with genuine love, supportive friends, and fresh opportunities. The echoes of Isaac's malice had finally faded, yet I never forgot the pain he inflicted or the depths of his cruelty. I harbored no illusions of forgiveness. I carried the lesson that one must stand tall against torment. Always tall. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, I recall his mocking laughter, the subtle digs, the relentless sabotage. I remember the fear I felt, worrying that his words would poison every connection I had. But then I recall the surge of triumph when I exposed him. I remember the look in his eyes as his fabrications unraveled. That memory warms me more than any fleeting pity ever could. Isaac never sought forgiveness, and I never intended to offer it. Betrayal of that magnitude deserved nothing less than the retribution it received. My conscience is clear and my heart is strong, unbreakable. As I finish recounting this story, I find myself oddly grateful for the ordeal. Isaac's cruelty forced me to confront my insecurities and learn the value of standing firm. It showed me the lengths to which some will go to maintain a facade of superiority. Most importantly, it cemented my self-respect. I refused to bend or endure endless humiliation. I chose retribution over futile forgiveness, and I stand by that choice. Life is too short to tolerate torment. If that means delivering a reckoning to those who harm us, so be it. I have no regrets, and I never will. And so, this chapter in my life closed, leaving behind lessons carved from anguish and vindication. Isaac retreated into the shadows, his name scarcely mentioned among our friends. In time, people moved on, focusing on their own joys and struggles. But the memory of Isaac's torment lingered in my mind, a sharp reminder of how far malice can go if left unchecked. I found strength in refusing to excuse his cruelty. Some might call me ruthless for denying him grace, but I see it differently. Protecting myself was paramount, and ensuring Isaac tasted his own poison felt wonderfully just. Indeed, I stand by that choice. I will never forgive the year of silent torture, the whispered rumors, the relentless humiliation. Forgiveness might be a gift for those who show remorse, but Isaac never did. He weaponized my kindness, ridiculed my background, and threatened to destroy my future. I met his cruelty with evidence, exposed him, and savored the justice. In the end, my story isn't about redemption or second chances. It's about a woman who refused to yield to a bully. I emerged stronger, unbroken. Isaac lost everything he tried to protect, and I regret nothing. My revenge was complete, forever.